All right, hello everyone, and welcome back for day two of the 2026 Green Builder Media Sustainability Symposium Systems Reckoning. We had a really good first day with Bill McKibben, Laura Sullivan, Jake Egren, and our builder panel of Megan Cordes, Rob Howard, and Brandon Bryant. In case you missed any of the action, Green Builder Media will be posting the recordings of both days on their YouTube channel in the near future. Now, we've got four speakers lined up for you today, with each of them covering more of a business theme today. And speaking of business, I need to take care of a little business by mentioning our sponsors. Trane Technologies is a world leader in creating comfortable, sustainable, and efficient environments. With a bold set of 2030 sustainability commitments, Trane Technologies is challenging the status quo and taking decisive action now to create a sustainable future where communities thrive, where equity is foundational, and where the environment is protected for future generations. James Hardy is the North American leader in fiber cement exterior design solutions. Hardy products offer personalized design options with trusted protection, low maintenance, and long-lasting beauty. James Hardy offers siding and accessories for every home style. TimberTech's decking products look more like real wood than any other composite. They resist scratches and stains, and they're easy to maintain. Because they don't need to thoughtlessly cut down trees to make it, their decking keeps the planet beautiful too. Provia offers durable, energy-efficient home exterior products including entry, storm, and patio doors, manufactured stone, and metal roofing in a multitude of styles, finishes, and custom sizes. And finally, the International Association of Plumbing and Mechanical Officials, also known as IAPMO, they are a global team of experts with deep expertise in codes and standards, which is applied to their rigorous product testing, certification and inspection services, professional development offerings, industry research, and their policy and advocacy work. Now, before we get to that aforementioned lineup of speakers, here to share some opening remarks is none other than the CEO of Green Builder Media, Sarah Gutterman.
Hello. Thank you, Mike, for your excellent moderation as always. Thank you also to Mary Kessner, our production manager, who is, as I like to call her, the wizard behind the curtains to make it all happen. A sincere thank you to our sponsors, Trane, James Hardy, IAPMO, Provia, and TimberTech. We could not do this work without you, and we also appreciate your leadership in sustainability. And thank you in advance to Andrew Winston and Lena Hansen and Tom Hoban and Neil Collins, who we're going to hear from today. Welcome to all of you to day two of the Sustainability Symposium Systems Reckoning. If you were with us yesterday, thanks for coming back. If you're just joining, you picked a good day. Yesterday, we set out to do something a little uncomfortable. We outlined why we called this 10th anniversary of our annual Sustainability Symposium Systems Reckoning. Not transition, not transformation, but reckoning. It's a hard word. The one that means that the bill has arrived and it's time for honest accounting. Each of our presenters yesterday left us with some worthwhile questions to bring forward into today's sessions. To briefly recount, I opened by calling the modern economy a cost relocation machine. What we celebrate as cheap is usually just cost that's been moved over space and time onto a household, onto a watershed, onto the next generation. The takeaway there is that, as I like to say, cheap upfront typically means expensive forever. And we need a new metric in the building industry, which we've named value per square foot, that finally prices in performance, resilience, health and wellness, independence into our homes and communities. The question that session left us with: what are we still refusing to recognize, count, and value in our systems today? Bill McKibben then delivered a dose of simultaneously sobering and hopeful news about the state of the world, but he emphasized that for the first time in his 36-year climate action journey, the cheapest energy on Earth is also the cleanest, and not one of the 93 million miles that the sun travels to get to the Earth passes through the Strait of Hormuz. The takeaway: what's holding us back is no longer engineering or economics. The question it left us with: if the technology has already won, as we're seeing, for example, in China, why hasn't the will here in the US? Laura Sullivan of NPR brought us to Asheville after Hurricane Helene, sharing a heartbreaking story about whole homes and communities reduced to matchsticks, as she called it, and one row of elevated flood vented duplexes standing untouched across the water. Jake Argon in that same session followed with an anecdote about the policy levers, the carrot, the stick, and the education that turn resilient building into standard best practices. The takeaway from that session: resilience is the new affordability, and the science and the money already exist. The question it left us with: why aren't we building resiliently yet in our built environment as well as in our companies, which Andrew Winston is going to address today? And then yesterday, our Vision House builders, Megan Cordes of Beazer, Rob Howard of Howard Building Science, and Brandon Bryan of Alair, showed value per square foot in action at every scale, from a national builder whose every start now is zero energy ready, to net zero prefab multifamily workforce build to rent housing, to custom wellness architecture design homes. The takeaway: build the home as a system, not a stack of features. The question it left us with: what purpose do homes and communities actually serve? And what do we owe to the people that live in those homes and communities? 4 sessions, one thread. The old math is breaking, and the companies and the builders and the leaders and the people that are going to thrive are the ones that are going to deploy honest accounting moving forward. If yesterday named the reckoning, today is about response. We're going to start with Andrew Winston, one of the world's foremost voices on sustainable business, who's going to make the case that action in sustainability and climate is not waning. It's just maybe using a different language. And he'll outline megatrends continuing to reshape business. Then Lena Hansen of RMI will explain that we're asking the wrong questions about energy. Rather than asking how much energy will we need, she'll assert that we'll need to ask questions like, how do we redesign demand for the comfort and the outcomes that people actually want? And then we'll close with Neil Collins and Tom Hoban, 2 regenerative developers on either coast of the US, talking about land capital and the long view. So during these sessions, we'll explore a fundamental question. What happens if we actually stop mispricing reality and take into account externalities to measure true value? Yesterday, we made the diagnosis. Today, we'll talk about the cure. Thank you for being here, and welcome to day 2 of the reckoning. Let's begin. Mike, back to you.
Thank you, Sarah. And for those of you who missed Sarah's opening speech yesterday, you really need to go back and watch that. It was very poignant. Next up is Andrew Winston. He is a globally recognized expert on megatrends, sustainable business, and how to build companies that profit by contributing to a thriving world. He was ranked number 1 on the Thinkers 50 list of the most influential management thinkers in the world. Andrew's books on strategy have sold well over 250,000 copies in 15 languages. In fact, the Financial Times selected Net Positive as one of the best business books of the year. Andrew writes regularly for the Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review. Andrew, welcome back to the Symposium, sir.
It's good to be here. Thanks so much. I'm sharing my screen so we can get started right away. Let me know if there's any issues. Thanks so much to Greener Building Media. It's so good to be back. I've been with you live a couple times. And I think my role today in kicking this off, which is an honor, is to step back a little bit, talk about where we are, talk about kind of the pressure on sustainability and the continued logic for action that I think we all need to have a sense of and keep making the case for in our organizations, because let's be honest, it's a really rough time in sustainability. It's been unlike anything I've ever seen in my kind of 25 years in this. And so, one of the questions that I see going around the sustainability world over the last couple of years is some version of, is it dead? Is corporate sustainability over? Do we have to change how we do everything? I mean, is it dead? No, is kind of the quick answer, but it's complicated, and I think you would be forgiven for thinking that companies were really pulling back because, starting last year, there were kind of big headlines, magazine covers saying, everything has turned. People are pulling back from their climate goals, their carbon goals. And it turned out that that wasn't really very accurate. It was really a lot of cherry picking. And there were some high profile companies that pulled back on their DEI issues or said we're not going to do net zero anymore. But maybe 10, 20, 30 of those companies were out there, but that left, say, 470 of the Fortune 500 who said basically nothing. And that's kind of continued, which is now called greenwashing. But so there was this sense that we were leaving this topic or we were not committed anymore. And then people started collecting actual data. And last fall, Accenture and the UN put out a survey to CEOs, and it was pretty fascinating because 99% said of the CEOs around the world said they're going to maintain or continue their kind of climate and sustainability commitments. I mean, I'm not sure I buy anything at 99%, but it indicates that at least they still thought they should say they are, right? Which is some sense of the kind of culture. But the other findings were really interesting that 88% of these CEOs said that the business case was stronger now than 5 years ago, which means the work that we've all been doing in this space, I think, has succeeded in many ways. But then they also said about half of them said that they were comfortable talking about sustainability. So I think the other half were probably lying. I mean, I think nobody's been really comfortable right now. So this was last fall, but then much more recently, there was data just looking at are companies maintaining their ambitions on decarbonization? And the answer is yes. Fundamentally, there's always going to be some ebb and flow in these things, but there's a small percentage that maybe have kind of stated that they're reducing their ambition, but there's more of them that are increasing, and most are just going along for the course, because most companies in the large company kind of sector had set carbon goals over the last 5 years, and a lot were science-based and were already shooting for net zero. So I don't expect that their ambition would go up that much. And just to kind of keep things going is kind of a victory right now. And there's, in this same survey, they said, there's evidence, continued evidence of higher profitability for the companies that are continuing to do this and integrate it into their product design and the way they operate. Now, more interesting to me was earlier this year, the CEO of Nestle, it was kind of a leaked thing where he had given this open speech to the global employees, and it was, kind of obviously leaked to the Financial Times. And he said, we've continued on sustainability and we've stopped talking about it. And he named Trump and named the US and said, because of that, everybody was kind of going quiet. But he said, we haven't stepped back and we should talk about it more. And I took this as a sign that some of the leaders were going to maybe start to come out a little bit more and be more comfortable talking about this again. I think especially, obviously, CEOs from outside the US. But just to step back for a second, I try to remind people that this backlash was real. It's, let's be honest, the full force of the US federal government is fighting almost every aspect of the sustainability agenda. They're, as a policy, trying to dismantle all sorts of legislation, environmental protection legislation. They're trying to stop renewables from being built, like stopping actual projects that were halfway done. So this is the plan. But why was there this backlash? I mean, there were lots of reasons, but it was partly because we were winning, right? There's no backlash to something that has no power, to something that isn't having an impact. And I would argue that we fundamentally did win in that sustainability is on the agenda of the largest companies in the world. And yes, they're being quiet in the US, but it hasn't gone away. And part of that is because the logic for action, and this is kind of the thing I want to keep reminding people, the logic for why we're here and why we got into this remains. And it's still very strong. And it's only been getting stronger. And I kind of do this in a pretty simplistic way and say, we need to act. And these are kind of the existential challenges we face that are both business cases, obviously, but also just existential, like can the world support us? Can we thrive? We have to, and that's, the pressure from stakeholders that remains, and the pressure from regulations around the world. Those are still there, especially the reporting requirements. And then we want to, which is kind of the traditional business case. Here's the ways we create value. And that's where a lot of sustainability has focused for many years. And we're kind of back into that now, just really focusing on this, make the business case. But I like to remind people there's this broader logic, and that the broader logic, I think, is how we continue to get buy-in and action. We kind of keep putting it at scale because the C-suite are very logically distracted from sustainability. It isn't just the backlash. It's that they're facing geopolitical forces, the tariffs, the Strait of Hormuz, AI. These are legitimate draws on their attention, and we have to kind of keep sustainability in there as one of the ways to build resilience in your business and to help deal with everything. And so, in the need to category is obviously climate change. I'm not going to get into the details or the science, but I just remind people that the reason business and society and countries were talking about climate was not that Greenpeace asked. It was that it's happening and that it's impacting us in a very real way, and it's costing business very seriously. And that equation of kind of acting on climate has really shifted, I think, a number of years ago, where the cost of doing nothing is very clearly in the trillions and becoming larger. And that is way higher than the cost of doing something about it. And that's both at the society level, the global level, and I think at the corporate level. And part of that is because a lot of the technologies we need have gotten radically cheaper. And I'll come back to that. So we need to act, we have to act. There's, I think, a couple really big mega trends that are unstoppable. And one is just generally transparency, the need to know about the products we use. There's the clean label movement in consumer products where people want to know what's in everything. And I think it makes sense. People believe they should know more about the products they're buying, the buildings that they're buying, the houses they're buying. And there's more and more laws forcing companies to report, to develop metrics and kind of gather data. It's happening in regions like California. It's happening in the EU, obviously, with their reporting directive. They've kind of shrunk the number of companies that it applies to the really big guys. But then they have supply chains that ripple. So this request for information is going to continue. And there's been all sorts of different laws that are transparency based. There's one in Germany that I love is the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. And I just love showing it so I can kind of make fun of the German language because they made it one word. That just makes me laugh, frankly. And I'm married into a German family, so I can kind of do this, and everybody else speaks German but me, which is probably not great. But there's this regional pressure. It's happening in lots of different places, and we've got the acronym soup that companies still have to respond to, especially the big guys. There's also the pressure of not just regulations, but what I think of as de facto regulations that companies are still asking questions. MIT did a study of supply chains, and it was just like the PwC on decarbonization. This was just, are your supply chain goals, are you continuing? Are you still asking questions? And 3/4 said their commitments hadn't changed, and an eighth or so said we're increasing it. So there's the regulatory pressure, there's the stakeholder pressure, and then there's just kind of generational change. And this is an issue in huge flux right now, but there's plenty of studies showing that younger people kind of care more about values and care more about the things they buy and really think a little bit more deeply. And this is normal. Values shift over time, generation to generation. So that's the kind of need to pressure. And then there's the want to, and we could spend tons of time. And years ago, when I would give a talk like this, it was really just about here's the value buckets. And this is a kind of 2x2 from my first book, Green to Gold, which is about to turn 20, which is kind of wild to me. But we laid out the kind of basic buckets of value creation in general. And there's really only so many ways we create value. We're either reducing the downsides of cost and risk, or building the upside. We're driving revenues through innovation, or building brand value, that kind of thing that's hard to measure, but is a vast part of the value of companies. And there's countless examples over many years of companies creating billions of value in cutting costs in very simple ways, in managing risks, or losing billions of value in mismanaging environmental risk. There's pure plays and companies with big chunks of their portfolio that are sustainable and are driving revenues. And then there's lots of companies finding that they build intangible value, in particular around employee engagement and retention. And this is all, I think, a story of innovation and growth. This is a way to innovate. These are the kinds of constraints in the world that drive innovation. And there's, I think, endless data that shows there's value here. There's just one kind of simple stat I saw recently that a huge portion of companies are capturing value from decarbonization. It's measurable. Now, part of the issue I think we have in sustainability is how we think about investments and measurement. And the tool, whichever companies use, it might be return on investment or IRR, NPV, it's some acronym for we're going to think about what this will create over time, and is this worth the investment? I think these tools are a little bit broken, especially when it comes to sustainability, because we're very good at measuring how much cash we have to put in, and that's easy. And then you kind of look at how much do we think is going to come out, and a lot of it's estimated, obviously. And when it's a sustainability project, it's asked to justify this ROI in a very detailed way, which frankly, most other functions aren't. I earlier in my career was in marketing and branding, and a lot of the ROI on a marketing project is made up. Nobody knows really, or launching a new product in a country, like these are estimates, right? But what happens with sustainability projects is the return discussion is kind of missing some critical elements that I think are particularly valuable with sustainability, which is the resilience that it offers, the kind of customer and employee loyalty, this idea of lifetime ownership, which is why things like EVs or electric fleets can be so valuable. Even if the truck costs a little more upfront, it's the lifetime ownership. And this is clearly true in greener buildings, right? This has been proven over and over again. It might cost more upfront, but what's the cost and the value, as Sarah was talking about, what's the value over time? And I think the logic here is that we should always talk about sustainability as investment. It gets categorized as a cost. And I just have always found that a little bit odd, because everything costs money. Everything's a capital choice. And for some reason, when it's this category, it kind of has this additional burden. Now, there's a lot going on lately in terms of companies going quiet. And I think there's kind of a misunderstanding where you see companies very clearly worried about pressure from the US government, from the president himself, from social media activists. And they've got this in their head about there's a cost to speaking out or to not capitulating to demands. And that's fine, there are, and you should, management should be putting values on these things. But there's also a cost and risk to giving in. We saw that at like Target, right? They pulled back from their DEI and they basically pushed away an entire critical segment of their customer base, the Black community, that said, okay, you're not on our side anymore. So there's these costs of changing and giving in that I think are very bad at measuring. And I think we're consistently missing that. And we are often, again, assuming that we have all the data for ROI, but I want to really challenge the idea that companies, and especially even CFOs, actually make choices on ROI and numbers. We know from kind of behavioral psychology, behavioral economics, that people make choices for many reasons. Usually it's kind of a gut feel, and then they look for the data to back it up. And I kind of can prove that lots of stuff in business does not have an exact ROI, because the number one thing that people are throwing money at now is AI. And we don't know the ROI. And in fact, I've been talking about this for a few years. I think AI is going to, revolutionize the world. I think it's got a very good chance of reshaping how our society is structured because the job changes. I mean, we can talk about this in the Q&A, but companies are running into it, and the studies keep showing that they don't actually know the payback. They haven't gotten good enough data. I think it's probably not being measured that well. It's kind of hard to say. I see in my own work where it benefits. I see it at clients that there's things that happen that I think the product might be better. There might be more information that you were able to get quickly, but it might not show up immediately as like a productivity thing. I think it's going to take a while for people to understand it. But right now, most companies can't say that it's paying off. And so we're putting all this money in without an exact ROI. So why do we do that? Well, because there's things in business throughout history that we add to what's considered normal business that at first is considered an expense. There is issues like safety. 100 years ago, this was a battle, right? Things like child labor and safety for workers was battled. Companies said it's too expensive to do something about it. And now it's a given. There's no company that says we don't care about safety. So issues, and this is, by the way, a real picture, not AI. This is a pre-AI picture. There's a great thing. You can just search like safety fails. Safety is one. Quality was a kind of new thing that the Japanese manufacturing brought in and expanded over decades into people have degrees in this. There's, certifications. Again, it seems like it could cost more upfront to do things right. And the first time someone said, let's do Six Sigma, we're going to have only one error in a million. I'm sure a lot of people said, why? That's expensive. But it's been proven to create value over time to build your business around these things. And lean manufacturing is another one. So these things become part of business. And I think where we were headed with sustainability was it was getting close to being just, hey, of course we do this. like these things. And that's, again, part of the backlash. So there's been a larger question I hear in the sustainability world that's kind of more philosophical about, did it fail? Meaning, you can look at some of the key metrics like carbon emissions and they're still rising, or loss of biodiversity or inequality, and they're not getting better. But that's not the same as a movement or our efforts failing. There's a counterfactual here. Like, what would it have been like without all these efforts? And I think it would have been far worse. But I think the reality is, and it's much harder for people to feel comfortable with this, is that we're in a kind of yin-yang duality where we can be winning and losing. Like, we did get this on the agenda. We are winning in some key dimensions, but emissions are still rising. So by definition, that is losing on climate. It isn't pessimistic to say that. That's just definitional. And it isn't a full answer to the question of did this whole movement work? But I want to kind of dive in for a few minutes into the big success story in the movement to a kind of more just and cleaner world, which is the clean tech. And there's so many debates about this, and I think it's not always in people's heads kind of the data around this about how fast some of this is moving. And I want to give people a perspective on what's happened in just electricity, because this is where renewables play on electricity generation. So if you look at the OECD countries, which is a group of 30 plus mostly rich countries, and you look at kind of 5-year increments in from 85 to 2005, each of those 5 years there was an addition to the grid of generation, not capacity, but this is like actual terawatt hours. Now, 1,000 terawatt hours can sound pretty meaningless. For context, the US electricity is something like 4,000 terawatt hours. So in each of these kind of 4 or 5-year buckets, over those 20 years, the rich countries added about a US worth of electricity generation, and they added mostly nuclear, gas, and coal, pretty logically, and just a tiny bit of some other things like hydro. But now let's look at the last 20 years, and it's radically different. And so there's people out there saying, oh, renewables aren't replacing fossil fuels because they're still a huge percentage of energy use. Yes, but in the countries that have started earlier, it is absolutely replacing fossil fuels. Coal has gone down dramatically. And in 2025, globally, not just in the rich countries, globally, all of the new electricity was basically renewables. And coal and gas were flat for the first time. And so this kind of movement is having a deep impact. It's how you get headlines like, after a century and a half, where coal was the vast majority of electricity in the UK, they shut their last coal plant. And you have the International Energy Agency saying this is unstoppable. This is now moving. The latest piece of data that blew my mind was, again, electricity generated in terawatt hours. These are countries and how much electricity they generated last year. If you ranked them, you would see that at the scale of Germany is China's increase in generation. They added generation equal to Germany's entire electric grid, and it was all renewables. So we're moving very quickly, and people will kind of complain about this data and say, oh, it doesn't reflect a real transition because it's just the new stuff. But that is how a transition works. Like, you start buying only the new technology and then you shut down the old ones. And it's not just electricity. We're now seeing this extend into the next big bucket of carbon, which is transportation. And as we start to electrify transportation, then the grid that's also getting greener starts to decarbonize transportation, right? So if you look at the global sales, the scale on the left is millions of cars, the bar chart, it's growing very fast. But then look at the percentage of cars that are sold around the world. We're at the 25% mark in 24. We don't have the full data yet on last year. It's estimated it's going to be getting to 30% of all new cars. Let me show you just China. China passed 50% in 2025. Actually, the far right one is 2025. And it's going to keep going. And in fact, it's happening in heavy trucks as well. As of December, more than half of the new heavy trucks in China were electric. So we're moving very fast. And so this is, I think, part of making the case that, yes, we should make the ROI case and the value, but we should broaden it and be talking more about the kind of scale of the challenges, and that we have to do this, and that there's incredible business value. I think part of the story is that, hey, business is moving. It is still moving, even if they're being quiet, so don't fall behind. And the transition is here, right? A transition of this scale, there's two grand technology transitions going on in the world. One is AI and one is clean tech. And I think they're going to have an impact on business, even if you're not in the value chain of energy, it has an impact. And so I think these are the ways that we keep pushing for the kind of speed and scale that we need. And we need a different scale. And this is part of the reason that, I wrote this book with Paul Pullman, the former CEO of Unilever. We made the case that companies now need to kind of move towards being net positive, which means profiting from improving the lives and everyone that you touch in your value chain, and solve the world's problems, not make them worse. This is kind of a core question we ask. Is the world better off because your business is in it? And I find that people kind of pause there, and it's a hard question. And I can't claim that any business is net positive, is only having a positive impact, but there are pieces of the story building. IKEA generates more energy on its stores than it needs, more electricity. So it is net positive on electricity, and it's now selling solar aggressively in stores, so it has an even bigger footprint. It's selling it to customers. So how do you build this kind of business? I'll just say very quickly, there's a couple key elements. One is setting really big goals. We're in this kind of a little bit of a pullback where companies don't want to put out the big goals anymore, but there's still some. And Train, I have in here anyways, not just because they're one of the sponsors. I've worked with Train for many years. They've had this gigaton goal of trying to help customers reduce their emissions by 1 billion tons. You have companies setting these kind of net positive or systemic goals about we're going to build a more regenerative economy. We're going to be net positive on biodiversity. These are really big, hard goals. There's also a need for partnership. The scale of what we need to solve now means you can't do it alone. And so there's a couple just great examples. My favorite story, I think, in my book is about Apple, and they partnered with Rio Tinto and Alcoa, and they built a new kind of aluminum technology and small plant that is basically net zero aluminum. And there's a lot going on in heavy industry now to basically electrify production. And they got effectively net zero aluminum. They bought a batch for some of their devices, but then the next batch was sold to Audi for an electric vehicle. So to me, that's kind of a ripple. They're creating a net positive ripple from their work. There's really interesting stuff happening in sectors, entire sectors coming together, working with the World Economic Forum. There's something called the First Mover Coalition, where companies say we will buy produced materials that were made in a greener or low carbon way. There's a pretty big move to what's called electric arc furnaces and steel. So there's stuff happening everywhere. These are all partnerships. And so I think for people in the sustainability world, one of the kind of key messages in net positive is that we've done mostly for many years, very logically, we've done the stuff that we can control within the four walls of the business. And that has been most of sustainability. And there's been plenty to do, right? And there's plenty of ways to reduce cost. And there's been kind of a small additional set of things where maybe you're working with peers on the value chain. There's sector initiatives. The Consumer Goods Forum has come together many times in that sector, and very little that really work on systems. And so Paul, my co-author, and I believe that we really are going to have to flip this pyramid to have the scale of impact that we need, where the things we do that are kind of within our control are a small part of the impact, and that you really expand the work that is sector or value chain based. It's what we call 1 + 1 = 11, where you're optimizing for everybody in that value chain, so everybody gets lower cost for, say, a new kind of low carbon material, or lower cost for the value chain of that business. And then there's the systemic stuff, and that requires really the whole system: business, civil society, government. And just as an example of what this might look like, and you would know your business is better, but the kind of four walls thing is like, okay, can we build a LEED building? Can we build one that's more efficient? Yes, and that's really important work. The next level up that's more systemic, that is kind of this work, the work that Greener Building Media does, which is how do you set standards, metrics, talk about value, work with the whole sector. And then there's these really much larger conversations about design in general, these ideas like a 15-minute city where people live in places where they can get most of the things they need. They can walk, they can bike. These are kind of the bigger systemic questions that we need to ask. We also need, I think, a new kind of leadership. And, Paul and I wrote this a few years back, and we kind of highlighted people we thought had a really interesting way of thinking about the human side of business. And Ajay Banga, who runs the World Bank now, was the head of MasterCard. He talks about decency and humanity and kind of caring about the people that work for you, that you work for, etc. I think decency is something that's missing a lot right now. And the other thing that's missing is fundamentally courage. Courage is at the core of what a kind of net positive leader needs to be. They should be inspiring and find their own purpose. And they need empathy and humility. I mean, these are things we're not seeing in leaders right now, right? They have to seek this kind of partnership, but courage is critical. And it's easy to talk about CEOs or senators or presidents, but like everyone can be a leader. And I think from wherever they are in their organization, they can lead. When we think about courage, we kind of have these images of, the sole person running into the burning building or stopping tanks. But in reality, most courage that works is actually at scale together. That's the kind of stuff that changes. We just saw a huge shift in Hungary that nobody expected. And this is what, we talk a lot about as collective courage, that you come together and say, what are the shared hurdles that we have? How do we work together to solve these problems? And we need courage to do it. And so the kind of, I guess, conclusion of all my work really is about thriving. And the idea that business can't thrive unless people and planet are thriving as well. So I ask, how are you going to be net positive? How do you take this question into your life, into your business? And I think the answer to that question is really what's going to build a thriving and just world. Thanks so much. I'm happy to take some questions. We've got, I assume, kind of 20 whatever minutes, 30 minutes. I hope there's some questions in the Q&A, and let me stop sharing so I can be seen again and I can see you.
Andrew, thank you so much. As always, your remarks are insightful and enlightening and fascinating. Of course, I have many, many questions for you.
Happy to. I'll
Yeah.
pretend I can answer them all.
Well, let's start with a few things that you mentioned during your presentation. It's always astounding to me to see the momentum that is happening internationally, particularly in China, with respect to advances in technology and sustainability and climate strategy. And I'm curious to hear, do you think that these advances internationally actually disadvantage the US? And if so, how? And then kind of the second part of that question is, how do we break through the current backlash against sustainability? Clearly, the economic ROI is there, but leaders here in the US, of course, are refusing to see it. So can we break through the backlash with numbers alone, or will it take something else?
Those are two really big questions. I'll try to be quick. Look, I think we're obviously falling behind. There's been this, when I've spoken for years, right? I give talks and people come up and I've gotten this comment like, why should we do climate stuff if China's doing nothing? I've gotten that for years and years, and it's just been so wrong. They've been pursuing an industrial strategy. And some people will say, they're not doing it because of the climate, they're doing it to make money. I'm like, okay, who cares? Right? Like, I mean, they have built the entire kind of solar and wind industry. They've sold cheaper stuff around the world. They're selling it so cheap that actually their own solar industry is kind of in trouble. They've competed so much that they're not making as much money. So there might be some changes in the industry, but it's still going to be cheaper than fossil fuels. And they've deployed at a just ridiculous scale, as I showed, just the example of the electricity generation last year. I think it was Thomas Friedman wrote a number of months ago that the US is just going to become a place like Cuba where you go to see old cars. If we're going to keep fighting this, and this administration is trying to slow down all progress for whatever combination of reasons, beholden to fossil fuel interests, just hatred of, I don't know what you can say. Trump hates wind for reasons that just make no logical sense. He says they kill birds and all that. There's just a kind of irrational hatred and this belief somehow that real industry, real energy is fossil fuels. And it's just so dated. That said, because of the economics, it's not going to stop the decarbonization here. It's going to make it harder. We're just going to go slower than we could, right? And it's going to hurt our auto industry more than anyone because they're not going to be able to sell as many EVs here because they took away the incentives. They made it harder here. So they're going to be less incentivized to keep developing their business to compete globally. It's just put them in a really hard place. So yes, China's winning. And we can debate all the things that are wrong with China and human rights and everything, but they dominate the clean economy, and they dominate the metals and materials that go into it. They're processing 90+% of most of those metals. Now, the really big question, how do you fight the backlash? I'm a little against I'm like the salmon swimming upstream on this one. It's funny, I spent so many years making the business case, right? Very simple, like here's the value. And the conclusion, I mean, almost every conversation I'm in, every sustainability event, every client over the last couple of years is we got to get back to the ROI. And we got to make the business case, which I don't get because we always did, right? But there's this sense somehow that it was always pitched as a moral argument. I just don't think that's true. And there's this, and I was talking to a CSO, and she said, "Yeah, we got the, the idea is we're becoming more professionalized." I'm like, "Do you think you weren't professional before?" And it's like, "Well, no, of course we were." But so there's this weird pullback to a place that I think we were 15 years ago, just like put it in monetary terms, and that's fine. I do believe, obviously, it creates long-term value, but I'm swimming upstream a little bit and actually think that we shouldn't give up on the moral or the societal, or at least the fact that we're all connected. I mean, if you talk about climate now, it's considered somehow a moral argument or a liberal argument. It's like, it couldn't be any more pragmatic to try to save the resources and the things that we live and survive and thrive on. Like, I think it's incredibly pragmatic to say, let's make sure we have the resources we need, like a stable climate, clean air and water, enough metals and forests and food. And, these are super practical. There's been a concerted effort to make it seem like somehow that's a liberal plot to keep the planet livable. So I don't think we should abandon, if you want to call it moral or just human, just not abandon the human argument. It isn't just about who makes the most money from it, right? It's also about humanity's thriving. And companies shouldn't be, I think, off the hook for being citizens of the world, for taking part. And that means also fighting for democracy. And they've gone completely silent. The US companies have been, I think, cowardly. Rational for their own perspective, individual companies, but the collective result is kind of cowardice and the rise of autocracy. So I think companies should be more on the hook to be part of humanity. And we're just not seeing that right now.
So here's another big question, Andrew. You've written extensively, as you've mentioned, about net positive companies. In your opinion, can capitalism, at least here in the US, evolve fast enough to become genuinely regenerative? Or is it impossible to reform a system that is fundamentally designed for extraction?
Yeah, it's the fundamental, we could spend forever on what is capitalism. I guess and there's a lot in this, people in the sustainability world say, look, the whole system is fundamentally broken. It is, but it's not clear to me if it's necessarily that capitalism is broken. It's been an interpretation of capitalism that has been completely extractive. And this idea of Darwin's about dog eat dog world, and Adam Smith said invisible hand, and all that's a really misreading of it. Adam Smith wrote about morality, actually, and that the invisible hand led to a more just world. So like, I kind of feel like it'd be good. I think my friend Hunter Levins has always said, yeah, we should do capitalism. We should try it sometime, meaning we haven't priced the externalities. Like if you put a price on everything and then let the markets work, we'd probably go a lot faster, right? If we price carbon, we're starting to see that with the cross-border kind of tax in Europe. We're starting to see some mechanisms to do that. I think capitalism, but there are more democratic, or call them socialist capitalists, like Northern Europe, Scandinavian countries. They're capitalists, but they have a greater safety net, right? They invest more in people. They invest more in the common good. You can do it multiple ways. So I'm not sure that capitalism is the problem necessarily, but it's been crony capitalism. And right now it's incredibly corrupt. And we have legalized corruption. I mean, aside from the corruption going on in this administration that's completely illegal, there's legalized corruption ever since Citizens United. Companies can give basically as much as they want. So it's not real capitalism. It's not, markets are great if things are priced, but we're not pricing all the damage. And so that's why if something's free, you're going to use infinite amounts, and the air, water, and climate are free. So, I think we can reform capitalism, but it means getting prices on things. And that requires the right kind of national and global policies and agreements to kind of say, hey, we got to internalize these costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And that's really kind of the thesis behind this whole symposium and a lot of the work that we're doing at Green Builder Media. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit. I subscribe to your Substack and I love it. So, everyone listening, I highly, highly recommend subscribing to Andrew's Substack. Oh, and look at Mary, like the wizard behind the curtain that she is. She just put the link into chat. Thank you, Mary. And in your Substack, in your blogs, you write a lot about AI, and I would say you have quickly become one of the preeminent experts in understanding AI and its impact on both business and the climate. So, level with us. Do you think it's helpful or harmful for sustainability and for the planet,
Yes.
or both?
Yes, and both.
Right.
I mean, let me give the quick take on where I think. Look, I believe AI is likely the biggest tech transformation in history. I mean, that's saying a lot. Obviously, there was the printing press, there was big stuff, but we've never had anything quite like this. We're inventing an alternative intelligence on some level, and so it's unlike anything we've seen, and it's going to, I think, restructure society in many ways. It has huge pros and cons. I mean, the pros that the tech companies say, there's truth to it. Like there's been AI for many years. There's things called machine learning. There's stuff. The new stuff. When people say AI, they're talking about generative AI. It's less clear that that's as necessary in the world, but it's here. AI in general, just smarter and smarter data analysis, pattern finding, is how you get things like much more efficient buildings, right? They're using it in your sector, obviously, in logistics, in transportation systems. There's clearly huge benefits to carbon, flight paths, everything. There's huge benefits. But we also have what's very clearly a huge energy problem as the data center build out is now exponential. And the tech companies were on path to be close to net zero and then just started a few years ago blowing through their carbon goals. Like their emissions were up 50% instead of down 5 or something. And it's because of the data centers. And that's a legitimate problem. I'm not as worried about that because tech gets more efficient fast all the time. Computing power needs less and less energy for the same computing power, or you get more out of it. I'm not sure it's going to work out to be as big as people think, but it is something I'm focused on. And if you go to my Substack, I'm in the middle of a series called Mastering Your AI Footprint, which I'm just trying to talk to people about understanding when they're chatting how much more energy you're using in certain ways, like depending on the model you choose when you're talking to, say, Claude, and depending on how you prompt and all sorts of, there's kind of key things. And we can be much better about that, just as we're learning this, as it's becoming part of everybody's job, and as millions and millions of people are going to start spending more time on it. But to be honest, the energy thing's a problem, but the thing I'm much more worried about is social, and just the jobs. And I have 2 Gen Z boys, one halfway through college, and I honestly don't know what to tell them about what jobs will be. That stuff worries me more, even than climate, which is wild because I've spent my career on climate. I think the energy stuff will kind of work its way out, but the social side is scary, and we don't know what this is going to look like as it takes more and more of what we think of as uniquely human and can do it, and can do it well and mimic us extremely well. So I don't know. We're in this unbelievable time of uncertainty and volatility, which makes, frankly, like who we have in power scarier, because this is a time where we need a steady hand on the tiller as the world is, coming apart in many ways, and we don't have that. So it's a scary time, and
Yeah.
I hope AI can help, but it's also going to be problematic.
Indeed. Well, I do agree with you on the energy side of things. I think, if we look at other entities that are energy intensive, like gaming and casinos, when MGM defaulted from NV Energy and just said, look, we're going all solar because it's more cost effective for us. I think at a certain point, the data centers do that with energy. I'm less certain about water, although I do think that there's some pretty innovative on-site water reclamation and reuse
Well, yeah, I mean, train,
strategies.
as you know, is a huge part of this
Mhm.
sector, and they have closed loop recycled water systems. They cost more. I mean, this is
Right.
partly where I think the people pressuring data centers, the people protesting changing
Mhm.
regulations, we should demand that the
Mhm.
data centers use recycled water, that they use more renewables. And if that means they cost a little more, okay, right? Like I think if using AI needs to be priced a little higher, so we do it in a way that isn't so devastating, that's fine. Because slowing down on AI net right now wouldn't be a bad thing.
Hmm.
It's going really fast,
Yeah.
too fast for us to adjust. So
Yeah.
I think there are solutions, right? And there's really good plans out there for regenerative data centers, just much smaller footprint. But the big guys need to do it. And that means maybe higher cost.
Yeah. Let me ask one more question about AI before we move on. And there has been this big scare and some actualization of job losses with AI. The way that I think about this is when we think about the Industrial Revolution, there were lots of job losses, but there were also many, many other job gains. Where do you think the largest amount of jobs will be lost, but also where will the largest amount of jobs actually be gained because of AI?
I mean, I like to pontificate on many things. I could make up an answer. I think to say I don't know is probably an understatement. There's been decent analysis. Anthropic, the Claude maker, has put out what they're seeing in organizations that are the most, I think, that are using AI the most in the kinds of roles. Like they have data on this, and they've put out charts to say these are the kinds of roles that are the most replaceable. And it's what you'd think, right? It's administrative. My niece is a lawyer, a second year lawyer at one of the really big law firms, and I said to her, "Are you still hiring as many first year lawyers?" And she said, "Yes, but the administrative layer is getting decimated, right?
Mhm.
Like the assistants, probably paralegals. There's going to be just far fewer of them." What I see in companies is it's not necessarily layoffs. It's just they don't need to hire as many. The next wave of work they need needs fewer new people. And so I think, look, anything that's kind of administrative is in trouble. You're right. Every new technology, there's jobs. I mean, the jobs that we do today, most of them didn't exist, right? 50, 70 years ago. So it is hard to imagine what it could be. I think a lot of smart people I see writing about this would say, the human's role is going to be kind of to keep AI on track because it hallucinates. It's got really weird things that it does wrong. I mean, it's just not a technology we've ever had before. Like when you say the word, okay, spell check, it can't say no. And like AI will just not do stuff you ask it to sometimes because it's decided or it's got multiple goals. I mean, I've seen this in the work I do with it. So I think part of the human role is going to be how to use this, but to like keep it focused and understand when it's useful, when it's not. The making up stuff is a problem. And so like using it just for finding data, it'll make it up. But there's also stuff that feels like magic it can do now. So I don't know. I think there will be some jobs that are probably more. The tech industry likes to say prompt engineer will be a job, but that's, I think, kind of a silly one because AI is a pretty good prompt engineer too. So I'm not sure. And I think there's entire types of jobs that will disappear, and we don't know. We don't know what might be created instead. But I do believe we're going to be having more and more serious talks about universal basic income and the ways to support society so everybody has kind of enough and sufficiency. And the tech guys have been talking about that for years, years and
Mhm.
years, which means they know what's in the lab. They know what they think this technology is going to do.
What is one assumption about growth that you believe that business and business leaders will need to fundamentally rethink over the next decade?
Yeah, look, there's a lot of degrowth talk. It's probably not a great phrase for marketing or for getting people behind something. It's probably not the best way to talk about it. I think, you know, I think the assumption that growth means growth in material is it doesn't have to, right? Or that it means growth in traditional measurement of profits. I think that the future is going to have to be, especially for the really big companies, because look, companies that have set their goals to keep growing because Wall Street wants it, if their goal is to grow faster than kind of inflation or faster than the economy, that mathematically can't continue forever, right? That, they would become the entire economy. So like there's some that are going to have to slow down. And I think the growth we're going to talk about hopefully is in quality, right? The quality of products, the quality of the livelihood of the people working for you, the quality of the value chain lives, the quality of the impact you have on people. I think that's going to have to be what grows in parts of the world, in certain sectors. We're going to need actual material growth, right, for the billion or 2 billion people at the bottom who need more material, right? Like that's just by definition to get them out of poverty. But the richest billion or so that uses most of the resources, I think we need a pretty hard conversation, a pretty hard look in the mirror. um, and that our demands on materials shouldn't grow. And we should be thinking about growth of what really creates well-being, which repeatedly has been shown to be not more stuff. When you have enough, right? When you're past that point, it's time with friends and family. I mean, nobody on their deathbed, honestly, is like, I should have been at work more, right? It's always about the people. And so I think growing that connectedness in how we think about our jobs, our livelihoods, and business is going to be, I think, what growth needs to be. And that's antithetical to business as it's been taught for 50 years. Just shareholder value growth is it. I think it's just too narrow.
So we've got a couple more minutes, and I've got one more big question for you.
Yeah.
What do you think are the must-haves that every business needs to incorporate moving forward to really future-proof their business? So I'm not just talking about having a sustainability strategy, but reducing risk, enhancing resiliency, bolstering supply chains. What are the things that are must-haves for
Mm.
businesses moving forward that haven't always necessarily historically been priorities, again, in order to make those companies future ready, versus what are the things that you're seeing that are just kind of corporate theater and, marketing language that don't necessarily future-proof a business?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'd say there's kind of on a tactical level that I think companies and sectors are going to have to really think about is, look, we built our system for efficiency, right? And when you make shareholder maximization short term the goal, you get to an efficiency standard, and the most efficient way to make something, to produce something, is to make basically all of it in one place at scale, right? And so we have sectors where there's pockets like that, and we've seen with extreme weather where there's a flooding somewhere, like in Thailand years ago, there was flooding, and all of a sudden there were no more hard drives for computers for weeks, right? We're seeing it with the Strait of Hormuz. Like, there's kind of a principle of diversity has redundancy, right? Our bodies have mostly redundancy, two lungs, you know what I'm saying? Like, we we are built so that there can be some failure. We have not built our system that way. We saw it during the pandemic. Like, most of the masks were made in Wuhan. Most of the swabs were made in Lombardy, Italy, the two places that went down first. And so there were shortages, right? And so I think it's more expensive, seemingly up front. It's the same thing that the oil industry went through after Exxon Valdez, which is, we should do double hull. They were more expensive, but not as expensive as one hull breaking and, there being a giant spill. So there's something in redundancy and diversity, and supply chains having multiple places, because there's going to be more and more things going down because of drought, flood. The climate is going to disrupt more and more of supply chains. So there's that. What was the other question? I got off on my diversity.
How do you differentiate the things that are must-haves for
Oh,
future-proofing
yeah,
versus just,
yeah.
corporate
Well,
theater?
the other must-have really quickly is systemic partnerships, is being focused on the kinds of transformative partnerships we need, and building those relationships. And that's what worries me about the green hushing right now, which is the movement continues, but the longer this green hushing goes on, I think the more damage is done, because it's pretty hard to do systemic partnerships if you're not talking to anyone. Because I think it's really core to solving these kinds of problems, and making something that seems more expensive and sustainability cheaper is by working together. And all of that answer gets a little bit at what's theater or not. I mean, I think there's a lot of accusations of greenwashing. I think they're generally a little bit overblown. There's pretty measurable stuff like, did you decarbonize? Did you buy more renewables? And you can kind of tell if a company, and look, the companies that pulled back immediately once there was pressure were never going to do much to begin with. There was a little bit of the wheat from the chaff, over the last couple of years, right? You lost 10, 20% of the companies that said, okay, we never wanted to do this anyways. To me, it's, it's not theater if there's measurable change, right? And that's why, as much of a pain as it is to have these reporting frameworks, you need data. You need some consistent amount of measurement to say, here's where we are in our footprint. And I think it's fairly easy to tell if a company's actually making a move. And I think the best companies actually are willing to fail publicly, that are willing to say, okay, we went down this path, it didn't work. Lego did this a couple years ago. They've been trying to find a new kind of plastic that was more recyclable for years. And they said, okay, we went down one whole kind of chemical path. It didn't work. And they just went public and said, okay, we're going to try to find another way. I thought that was great, right? It doesn't have to be that you're perfect. It has to be that you're working on it, right? And you're working with the partners that can help. So that's when I know it's real, is are they working in systems, working in partnership, talking to their peers, willing to talk to government on policy, not just to lower their taxes, but to change the kind of pricing or to work on externalities or the things that are needed to move the system. That's how you know it's real.
Wonderful. Well, Andrew, you and I are friends. We could talk for hours. I could listen to you talk for hours. But one thing that I know we've both come to in the last handful of months is we like to close everything we do with something that inspires that courage that you spoke
Mhm.
about. So, literally in 30 seconds or less, because we got to hop over to Lena, give us one inspirational tip that will help us all muster that paramount in courage.
Look, I'm optimistic. As I've mentioned many times, the clean tech stuff is amazing, and we're heading towards this cleaner grid and transportation. That's just inspiring. I guess lately, what I have found inspirational is worth, admiring and copying is the people of Minneapolis, the people of
Mm.
Hungary. Like these movements can happen against the toughest odds, but it means going together, and that's really inspirational when I see people kind of willing to work together and demand better of their leaders and of society. So I have some optimism for that. It's really hard right now. It's really hard, but that's why we need each other. And I think especially in this field, we need to come together as much as we can and in person too, because you need to have that kind of human touch. So that gives
Mm.
me some hope that people can come together.
Wonderful. Well, Andrew, thank you as always for your incredible insights, for your leadership, and for your work. Thanks for being in the trenches for the last couple of decades
Thanks
because
for all you're doing on changing the metrics, building a greener built environment. It's really important. So thank you.
yeah, wonderful. Well, I will talk with you soon.
Okay.
And
Take care.
thank you again for being here. And Mike, back to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Appreciate it, sir. Yes, we are now going to transition to a session about the forthcoming energy transition. Lena Hansen is the Chief Program Officer for Geographies and Strategy at the Rocky Mountain Institute. You probably know them as RMI. She leads RMI's geographic portfolio of programs, strategic insights team, and overall organizational strategy, helping connect work across the organization to accelerate the global energy transition. She brings more than 20 years of experience developing, testing, and scaling high impact efficiency and clean energy solutions. Now, Lena has co authored many reports and articles at RMI, and you might remember her 2011 book, Reinventing Fire: Bold Business Solutions for a New Energy Era. Lena, welcome to the Sustainability Symposium.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
All right. Do you have some slides you're going to share with us, or you're going to have a discussion with Sarah?
I have some slides, so
Okay.
let me see if I can get those pulled up.
Yeah, you have the ability to share your screen.
All
And
right. Let's see. Is that in full
that
screen?
looks great.
Super. Well, I'll go ahead and kick off if that's okay.
Very good. Thank you.
Super. So, thank you everyone for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about designing demand. And the first thing I want to start by noting is probably the obvious, which is that we are living through a very remarkable moment in energy. Um, for most of my career, at least, the conversation has been about decarbonization. But today, increasingly, that conversation is about constraints, right? Can we build fast enough? Can we connect enough load? Can we secure enough supply chains? Can we keep our energy affordable? And can we do all of that while demand is forecast to grow faster than anyone would have expected just a few years ago? So those questions are really forcing us to once again rethink some pretty basic assumptions about the energy system. And that is what I am excited to talk to you about today. So first, just to start with the fact that a few things are really happening simultaneously, right? So first, we are facing very volatile energy prices, inflation, increasing affordability pressures. And historically, it's been the case that interest rate shocks follow energy shocks, and the housing market, the real estate market is painfully sensitive to interest rates, as are many other things. So we're seeing all of that happen. Second, we're seeing a rapidly changing climate, faster than many scientists thought would be the case, which is really creating new stresses across the system. And then third, electricity demand forecasts are rising really dramatically. So AI and data centers are getting most of the attention, but they're not the only driver. Cooling demand is exploding in this warming world. Electrification is accelerating across transportation and buildings and industry. And none of those are bad things, right? Data centers represent innovation. Cooling represents prosperity and adaptation, and electrification is ultimately how we reduce emissions. So the problem isn't demand growth in and of itself, it's that we're trying to meet that growth with a 20th century playbook. So these three things that I've listed here are not separate challenges. They are really deeply interconnected. We are finding that growth itself is starting to compete for energy, right? So in the US, electricity demand is forecast to increase up to 25% by 2030 and up to something like 80% by 2050. In some regions, new demand for data centers is creating real concerns about crowding out other forms of development, from housing to commercial growth to industrial investment. And the traditional answer, right, has been very simple, which is to build more. But increasingly, building more is taking longer, it's costing more, and it's becoming a lot harder. So for the first time in a long time, we're running into really real limits and constraints. So we see that, as I mentioned, around demand growth, but also around the physical constraints of our system, around procuring gas turbines. I think the last I read, the wait for gas turbines could be as much as 6 years. We know, especially in this country, that transmission is notoriously difficult to build. And increasingly now, geopolitics are exposing the fragility of the energy system and driving up prices. So this is one of my favorite, albeit pretty crazy statistics. At the very moment that we are worried about energy scarcity, the world wastes more gas every year through venting and flaring than moves through the Strait of Hormuz. So think about that for just a minute. One of the most strategically important energy checkpoints in the world, and we are wasting more gas than it supplies. So that tells us something really important, that the challenge isn't simply a shortage of energy, it's how inefficiently we use the energy that we already have. And it points to a different solution. So historically, we have forecast demand and then built supply to meet it, right? So you forecast demand, you build generation, you build pipelines, transmission, infrastructure. And that model makes a lot of sense, or it made a lot of sense when demand changed slowly, when infrastructure could be built relatively predictably. But it has two major weaknesses that we're coming up against now, right? First, forecasts are often wrong, as you can see here on the left. And second, it assumes that demand itself is fixed. And what those things together mean is that our system is very often overbuilt and underutilized, especially in the case of the electric grid. So the central idea that I really want to share today is this, right? The assumption underneath a lot of the anxiety about load growth is that demand is destiny, and that whatever demand forecast shows up, we simply have to serve that. But that assumption is wrong. Demand is not fixed. It is not a law of nature. Demand is a design choice. And thanks to really remarkable advances in efficiency, electrification, flexibility, digitization, and controls, we have more ability than ever before to shape demand. And that really changes everything. So when we zoom out and look at the entirety of the energy system, we see something pretty remarkable, and that is that roughly 2/3 of all energy never creates real value, right? Most of what we produce is lost through production, transportation, end use inefficiencies, especially with a predominantly fossil fuel system. So we are spending enormous amounts of money moving energy around, transforming it, and ultimately wasting it. And those of you who know Rocky Mountain Institute will not be surprised to hear me say that this observation brings us back to one of our founders, Amory Lovin's most important insights, and that is that the energy system does not exist to produce energy, right? It exists to provide services that meet our needs. So we don't want kilowatt hours. We want comfort and mobility and productivity, and we want cold beers and hot showers, right? But somewhere along the way, we sort of flipped that logic and started optimizing for energy production instead of for human outcomes. But really, what we should be doing is starting with the service that we want and designing the system sort of backwards from there. So if we start with the end use and sort of flip the script, right, something really powerful happens. Every unit of demand that we eliminate downstream at the end over here on the left creates much larger reductions upstream, right? And that is because inefficiencies compound throughout the system. So a more efficient vehicle doesn't just save fuel, it reduces refining losses and transportation losses and generation requirements and infrastructure requirements. So in this example that I have here on this slide, if you save 5 units of energy at the end by buying a slightly more efficient car, then you might save 23 units of primary energy at the beginning. And that's why efficiency is so powerful, because really small improvements at the end ripple through the entirety of the system. I think sometimes that efficiency gets a bad rap. It is not an austerity story, right? Efficiency is a competitiveness story. So today, roughly 4.6 trillion worth of energy spending goes up in smoke every year, just because it's wasted, right? And that's about 5% of global GDP. So that means the opportunity here isn't about sacrifice, but is really about value creation. Our CEO says often that no CEO wakes up wanting to consume more energy than is necessary, that no economy becomes more competitive by wasting inputs. So demand side innovation is fundamentally about producing more value with fewer resources. So efficiency and designing demand have always been important. The difference now is that they're becoming urgent and also much more valuable. So back to my constraint slide that I shared from the beginning, I would say that this does not have to be a bad news story, all these things that we're looking at, right? Designing demand can help us see a way through these constraints, right? We can't build our way out of expected load growth fast enough or cheaply enough. But we can design demand so that we don't need all that new supply, which opens up a lot of headroom for growth. Designing demand also means that we can localize energy resources in ways that reduce or eliminate dependence on a lot of the physical bottlenecks that are creating problems now. And it reduces our exposure to energy shocks and to supply constraints. So for decades, efficiency was treated as an afterthought, but today it really is becoming a strategic capability. So how do we design demand? What does that actually mean? At RMI, we think about it through 4 complementary strategies. The first is to reduce it through efficiency. The second is to shift it through flexibility. The third is to upgrade it, and the fourth through electrification. And the fourth is to supply it cleanly. Efficiency reduces the amount of energy that is required. The flexibility, right, shifts when it is used. Electrification upgrades how services are delivered, and then renewables provide the remaining energy that is required more cleanly. But the real power comes from combining these four approaches. So the idea of energy by design isn't that it's just one thing, right? It's not about a specific technology or a specific widget. It's about how we bring intentionality to the choices that we make, really starting with the end use in mind. So that lets us see system level opportunities that are often underappreciated or overlooked. And yes, we can and should install efficient light bulbs and air conditioners. That's what's here on the right? But even better, better intervention points are if we open the aperture a little bit to look at a whole building or a whole facility or a whole vehicle, really designing the building envelope to reduce lighting or air conditioning needed in the first place. And even better than that is opening the aperture even more to look at how we design our neighborhoods and our communities over here on the left. And that's where we really get the most leverage. So the key insight is that the biggest opportunities are often not individual technologies, they are system design decisions. And that once you start designing buildings and neighborhoods and communities around the outcomes that we want, the need for energy falls really dramatically. So I want to just talk you through a few examples because I've been talking a little bit theoretically at a high level about what this actually means in practice and what's possible. So cooling may be one of the best, if not the best, example of why this matters. We all know, driven by climate change and accelerating consequences of that, that global cooling demand is growing really rapidly. Not only in India and sub-Saharan Africa, but also in the UK and all around the world. Cooling demand is growing really, really significantly. The traditional response to that would be to build more power plants. But we can do a lot better than that now. We can reduce heat gain through urban design. We can use low-cost cool roofs. We're experimenting now with some PDRC, sort of white paint on roofs of homes in India. We can improve building envelopes. We can deploy super efficient air conditioners. We can rethink cities themselves, right? And when we do all of those things together, or even just a few of those things together, we can deliver the same level of comfort. We can address the heat stress that so many people and communities around the world are facing with dramatically lower energy demand. And that means lower bills. It means lower peak loads because air conditioning in particular drives up electricity peaks in most places. It means less infrastructure, and it means much greater resilience, and also, frankly, much improved human health when we look at the consequences of heat stress. So here's an example of what's possible when all of that comes together. Since 2018, RMI has supported the Lodha Group, which is India's largest real estate developer, to design and build Palava City. So this is a greenfield net zero energy city outside of Mumbai that is currently home to several 100,000 people, but on the way to being home to 1 million people. And it's really designed as a living lab, right? A living lab of how we design our cities and buildings and transportation systems in a very different way, in a much more sustainable way. And what we see in Palava City is this idea that smart growth is sustainable growth in the true sense of the word, right? In that growth is possible because of smartly designed demand and the way that the energy systems are designed. So Palava is walkable and accessible. It has green space that really meaningfully reduces heat stress. Every building is built with low emissions materials and efficient appliances. They are now testing low-cost 5x efficient air conditioners. And this has really helped make possible meeting now 95% of their remaining energy demands with renewables, right? And I'll just do a quick double click on the super efficient air conditioning just to really demonstrate what's possible with innovation and with intention. A number of years ago, we, in partnership with many others, held what was called the Global Cooling Prize. And the idea was, can we create a contest for innovators and companies to design a 5x efficient air conditioner at a reasonable cost, at low cost. And out of that competition, there were two winners who demonstrated a 5x efficient air conditioner. And what has happened then is that those were sort of given additional support, moved through some sort of incubator and acceleration programs to drive towards scale. And those same 5x efficient air conditioners are now being tested at scale in Palava City. The amazing thing about Palava, too, is that when we think about this as a pilot project or a lighthouse project, it's a pilot project of hundreds of thousands of people, which gives us some really great data and sort of proof points of what's possible with innovation. So this is really not a story about sacrificing growth. It's a story about enabling growth, right? That you have what will be eventually 1 million people living with dramatically lower energy demand because demand was designed from the beginning instead of as an afterthought. So one more example that I want to share is about data centers, right, which really present a similar opportunity. So everyone is talking about data centers. In the few minutes I dialed in, while Andrew was answering some questions, there's a lot of discussion about data centers and AI, and is the demand that's forecast for data centers real, and what might that look like? But the reality is that the huge amount of new load that is forecast because of data centers and AI is predicated on an assumption about the energy intensity of those resources. And we don't have to take that as a given, right? We've done a lot of work in the past on making data centers more efficient through advanced cooling and more efficient chips, better software design, all sorts of things like that. And the reality is that flexibility and efficiency, especially at this moment in time, can be the fastest and cheapest ways to meet data center demand, especially given, as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that gas plants, which is sort of the default assumption about how to power data centers, are in short supply and high demand. And so when we look at the ability to put on-site renewables and storage and efficiency coupled with flexibility alongside data centers, it actually creates the opportunity to not only build those data centers faster, but also to put much less demand on the grid in a way that then creates growth headroom for other parts of the economy. So last few slides here, just to say that especially in the US, load growth really is dominating the news today. And we can see from peak demand forecasts looking out into the 2030s that this will in fact be a real challenge if not managed appropriately. So I want to just take a moment to talk about the impacts to the grid, right? When we combine efficiency with flexibility, demand can really become a resource, right? So for decades, we have treated demand as a liability, but increasingly it can become an asset. And what we find is that the fastest way to add capacity is often not to build something new, but to use what we've already built much more intelligently. And that's exactly what flexibility in the form of sort of virtual power plants, as I was just describing about data centers, allows us to do. So what we see here is this sort of look at how peak growth might increase in the U.S., how that might be even further exacerbated by retirements of existing plants just due to age. And so, the potential for 271 gigawatts of new peak capacity needed in the 2034 timeframe, right? So to put those numbers in perspective, 149 gigawatts of growth is about 20% of US record peak demand. And 271 gigawatts is more than a third of that record demand. So if all of this came to be, and I agree with Andrew, it may not, that would be incredibly significant. And the ability to just simply build supply to meet that demand is hard to fathom, right? But if we look at the potential for energy efficiency, for virtual power plants, which is the combination of efficiency and storage and renewables and other things, for grid enhancing technologies, for repowering, and a variety of other things, what we find is that peak demand that is forecast and that everyone is talking about and scared of in many ways does not need to be. And that is, I think, the opportunity that we have. So I'll leave you with just one final thought, and then I'll end and hand it over to Sarah, I think. In a world defined by constraints, the strategic question facing us is really not how much energy we'll need, but it's about how we design the system to deliver the services and the human comforts that we value. And the countries and the companies and the communities that learn to shape demand will be able to build faster and spend less, waste less, and be more resilient. Because ultimately, the most resilient energy supply chain is the one that does not exist. So that's where I want to leave you with my thanks for your time. And with that, Sarah, I will take down my slides and hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Lena, well, first of all, thank you so much. My mind, and I've heard you speak, I've heard Amory speak, we have had John Kreitz, my CEO, on this symposium. And every time I hear anyone from RMI, including Chris Magwood, who I see is in attendance, hi Chris. But anytime I hear anyone from RMI present with the data that you have and your extensive knowledge, it always blows my mind. Today in particular, the concept that you're presenting that, we need to change the way we think about demand as destiny to demand as a design choice, really looking at those whole systems and integrated systems is so important. I know that I like to say that, these systems that we have today, many of which are inherited, like we did not design them from scratch, right? Generations ago, designed a lot of these systems, but they were built by people and they can be rebuilt and reimagined by people. And the metrics that govern those systems are not the laws of physics. They are the laws of conventions, and conventions can be changed. So with that in mind, what is, and I almost hate to ask, what is the single most impactful change that we can make, but what is the single most impactful change that we can make? Or maybe two or three, if you don't want to limit it to one.
There's probably a long list. But if I were to pick just a couple, and maybe these are a little bit apples and oranges, but the first one I'm going to start with, because we've been talking about this a lot at RMI, is really recognizing and owning the fact that we all have agency in the world to make different choices, right? And to make our own choices. I think for so long in the energy system, we didn't have agency. The system was run by, others and utility, and we were just receivers of that. But with new technologies, with batteries, with the amazing cost reductions of rooftop solar panels and all of the things, like we now have, as individuals and as communities, the ability to shape our energy destiny in a way that we have not in the past. And I think that that requires, a mental model shift to really realize that and own it. But we find that very encouraging and empowering at RMI. So that's one. I think like owning that agency. The second one though is pretty different, which is that I actually think while there's a huge amount of work to be done in innovation and in developing new technologies, we actually have a lot of, if not most of the technologies we need to engineer the energy transition. Um, and so I actually think that one of the biggest things that we can make progress on in the next few years is rather around the business models that allow those technologies to work, right? That's where we spend a lot of time, many others do as well, is what are the financing structures and the rate designs and the, new ways of making money from efficiency and reconciling the sort of misaligned incentives that exist. Like that's where I think there's so much opportunity, because as soon as you can crack that nut in certain places or for certain parts of the system, you unlock just a tremendous amount of potential and momentum. So two pretty different ones, but that's what I would call out.
Both, equally as important. So let's lean in a little bit into some of the business models and the alignment of incentives, because I agree with you. I think a lot of our short-term and long-term incentives are just pointing in different directions. And clearly we've got legacy business models that don't necessarily support the energy transition. I think certainly, if anything, the PPAs in the solar sector kind of helped break through with some of that creative financing. But so can you tell us, give us some examples of some of those business models or creative financing models or incentives that you're seeing right now that you think, one, are really positively influencing and expediting the energy transition, and two, that should be replicated?
Yeah, a few that I would name. And the thing about it is, I think that none of these are particularly new or profound. It's really just a question of um, how do you design them in a way that's going to stick, that's going to be able to be adopted really broadly, right? And so, I mean, number one, I'm again, not profound. We all know that utilities are paid for throughput, right? And so the most important thing that we can do is break that connection and ensure that not only utilities but others are paid for the end use services they provide and not the kilowatt hours at the start of the system. So Amory has talked for a long, long time about the idea of, what would it look like if we actually had a system where um, businesses were paid to deliver cooling and instead of to deliver kilowatt hours and air conditioners and all the different things, right? You would suddenly have a really different incentive system to actually maximize the efficiency with which those businesses provided that cooling at the end of the chain. So I think there's some really interesting thinking that is happening and to be had in that area. There's also things that are much more straightforward, like how do we provide on-bill financing for efficiency in a way that helps customers overcome the sort of first cost barrier of those resources and technologies? So, a whole set of things, including many that I'm sure others are thinking about, and we need to really find a way to elevate.
So, what are the key levers, either from kind of the financing or perhaps the policy angle, that are going to help push through rapid and massive adoption of these business models, these incentives, these creative financing solutions at scale?
Yeah. So we are doing a tremendous amount of work now alongside many, many others at the state level, working with public utility commissions. And I spent many, many years at RMI leading our US electricity practice. So I've spent a lot of time working with public utility commissions. And I know sometimes people think, oh, they're very slow or they're very, hard to move stuff through. But actually, like that is such an incredible leverage point to unlock a lot of this. And so I think, finding the right ways to help commissioners and in particular the staff of commissions like really solve some of these problems in ways that are practical, and then to be able to scale that through shared lessons learned across different states, and across different places is one of the most important levers. The other, and this is a little bit different, but I think part of the problem in the last couple decades is that we as a society have lost interest in efficiency because it's not nearly as sexy as renewables, right? And like as the costs of renewables have come down, so much focus has been on that and so much focus has been on the supply side of clean energy, which is great. Like to be clear, it should be, right? Our global targets around renewables are, I hesitate to say on track, but making tremendous progress. But that has come at the expense of, I think, attention to and interest in efficiency. And so I think also one of the things that, can be done and needs to be done is the re-elevation of efficiency in the global dialogue and in boardrooms of, investors and banks and large corporations, to really bring the attention required to make these changes happen. Because again, there's not innovation needed in at least in a lot of ways here. It's just a matter of institutional innovation and creativity and commitment to doing so.
Yeah, that's interesting. Here in the housing sector, we, those of us who are like building science and efficiency wonks like myself, like to say, like, look, you can slap solar panels on a leaky home or building, but at the end of the day, you're just gonna have a leaky home or building with solar panels on it. You got to address performance and the building envelope and fenestration and all of that. Um, so switching gears, we're seeing, well, we'll say we're seeing globally a lot faster of a transition from a centralized to a decentralized grid. Like I think Germany is a great example. I think they're one of the most advanced examples of, every rooftop right now is an energy producer, and the grid, the utilities there have shifted from a one-way delivery system to an interactive, basically transporter of energy where it grabs energy where there's extra and it drops it off where it's needed. Here in the US, we are slowly but surely shifting from that centralized to the decentralized model, partly to decrease grid stress and reduce things like brownouts and blackouts, partly to provide energy independence to homes and communities and buildings and cities. And then, certainly the VPP really plays a part in that. Can you talk a little bit about that transition here in the US? How does it play out? What's the timeline? And then, if you could, just for folks on the call that maybe aren't as familiar with the concept of VPPs and how important that is in this transition, if you could talk about those things, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it's easy to be pretty depressed about the state of things in the US, in terms of the energy transition. But I think in reality, a lot of momentum is there and a lot of progress continues to be made. And that is driven by the fact that, at least in many cases, not in all cases, these resources, be it efficiency or solar plus storage or whatever it happens to be, are increasingly the least cost resource and also are increasingly the fastest resource to deploy. And I think, as I was saying during my presentation, when there is this very significant, at least risk of load growth in the US, that causes all of these slowdowns and bottlenecks around sourcing centralized equipment. And a lot of that can be circumvented with the right combination of distributed resources. And so I actually have a lot of optimism about the state of the energy transition here for those reasons. And also, I didn't mention this so much, but a little bit, because I think that we are all collectively really becoming very aware of the energy security and resilience implications and cost implications of importing fossil fuels from other parts of the world, and the role of efficiency and renewables in um, decoupling ourselves from that, right? And so I think that there are a whole set of reasons why people can and are adopting these resources, separate from just climate or environmentalism. And so that gives me a lot of hope. I don't know that I can answer your question, Sarah, about like exactly the timing of the transition. But I see momentum in the right direction, and I see a lot of action on the specific leverage points, like I mentioned, with, regulators and with financiers and other things that will help it move faster. When there are also a lot of little bright spots in different parts. But on your question about VPPs, so for folks who are unfamiliar with virtual power plants, this is something that we spend a lot of time working on and thinking about. And the concept at most basic, right, is that if you have a natural gas power plant, it provides a set of services to the grid. And so, what are the ways that you can create a portfolio of resources, combination of efficiency and renewables and batteries and demand response and other types of, grid flexibility that provide all those same services? And so that's what we would call a virtual power plant, this collection of resources that can do that just as well. And there is a tremendous amount of opportunity to deploy virtual power plant capacity in this country in a way that meets our grid needs and offsets the need to build new fossil fuel power plants.
And speaking of creative business models and financing opportunities, I found that there are some VPPs that are actually providing revenue generation opportunities
Yeah.
for, say, homeowners if they participate in those VPPs, or builders, especially if they participate in those VPPs at a community scale. So I think there's some really interesting kind of revolutionary thinking going on the revenue side of that.
I just put solar on the roof of my house here in North Carolina, and am part of a virtual power plant program. So yeah, exactly. You now can be directly compensated for the ability of your personal resources, your solar, your battery, to support the grid when called upon. And it's really creative and a huge incentive.
Fascinating. We'll have to hear more from you, down the road to hear how that's working. All right, I've got a loaded question for you. If your thesis and RMI's thesis is that energy systems exist to deliver comfort, mobility, human well-being, health of the planet, not kilowatt hours necessarily, what does that imply about how we should be measuring economic success?
It's a good question. It's a loaded question. But I think that the most fundamental thing for me is that if in fact energy systems exist to deliver services, then success should be measured by outcomes rather than inputs.
Mhm.
And as you and I have been discussing so far, we don't really care about kilowatt hours. We care about comfort and productive factories and healthy communities for our kids. And so one of the, I guess, strange things, right, about our economy is that we often celebrate the consumption of resources rather than the value that those resources create. Um, I'll just harken back to one of Amory's very, very early observations in his career, right, which was the assertion that GDP growth and energy do not need to be coupled. And up until that point, like it was assumed that GDP growth came along with a commensurate energy growth. And that what we've actually seen then in the last few decades is the decoupling of GDP growth from energy use. And I think that there's something in there which is so incredibly powerful and important, which is to start to shift our mindsets towards value creation as compared to inputs. And that's just very logical. Now, it's very hard to do. It's very hard to have a business model that's based on providing lighting as a service as compared to light bulbs. So I'm not suggesting that's easy, but I think that that's ultimately, what advanced economies have to move towards is looking at how we deliver better lives and better livelihoods for people with fewer inputs.
Fascinating. Thank you. What do you think is going to happen first to transform the status quo in the energy system? A breakthrough technology, a breakthrough business model, or a breakthrough in human behavior?
You never know. There could be some amazing silver bullet technology that gets created. But as I said earlier, I think that most of the technologies we need for the energy transition exist. So I don't think that the thing that we all need to be waiting for or that's going to completely change the game is a brand new widget. Um, I think it's well, it's probably a business model, right? That's to our earlier conversation. I think that it's business model innovation that is going to demonstrate that ability to like make money by creating value, right? And make money by using less resource and overcoming some of the split incentives that we see. So my hope is that there are probably not just one, but like a set of unlocks in that space that just make it much, much, much easier to reap the benefits of efficiency and distributed resources in terms of affordability and resilience and all those things. The reason I hesitated is just that I think at this moment in time in the world, given the everything we're seeing in the Middle East and the price shocks because of the closing of the Strait of Hormuz and all of those things, I do really think that that is like rearranging people's mental furniture a little bit, right? In terms of understanding in ways that we haven't for a long, long time, the fragility of our current system. And so maybe, Sarah, like maybe there's a behavioral thing, right? Or maybe there's a sort of motivational thing where people say, I'm tired of that. Like I want to do something different. I want to have, a greater sense of security of my own energy system and, feeling of resilience in the face of storms and I need to like save money too. And that could actually be the thing too that creates a lot of unlocks. So I wouldn't have said that maybe a few years ago, but I think that that's a possibility.
I've been thinking a lot about this concept lately, Lena, particularly in light of the Strait of Hormuz closure and the war with Iran, in terms of, historically we've seen, for example, increase in EV sales when gas prices have gone up, but then those wane once gas prices come back down, and there's a surge in purchases of larger, not necessarily efficient SUVs. And I think we could apply that to a lot of different categories and sectors. But I wonder, I'm hopeful that what you say is true, in that all of a sudden this war, this moment in time, is subtly and not so subtly changing some perspective and long-term behavior here in the US, because of this concept of, national energy independence as it coincides with the rise in demand for localized, decentralized energy and energy independence at a home and a community scale, which by the way, I've started hearing, this is interesting, that energy independence is patriotic, which it is. I love
It
that.
is.
It's patriotic, but all of a sudden, it's becoming a risk reduction element, and something that is well, maybe it is political, but it's crossing both sides of the aisle in that way. So, I'm curious to hear, do you believe in your heart that this behavioral change is, let's say, longer term than we've seen with historical just market fluctuations and rises in, say, gas prices?
Yeah, I mean, you never know. It's hard to say because I suddenly gas prices could go down and people could go back to normal. But I just having been an observer of the energy transition for more than 2 decades now, I think that there's something that is truly different about this moment. We talk a lot about, maybe after a big hurricane, or something, or a big storm, or some big, that will shift behavior and change behavior. But I think that sometimes those things are um, so discrete and also seem out of our control in ways that don't actually fundamentally shift behavior. But this to me seems different because we've been seeing more and more conflicts. I think that geopolitical tensions are not going to go away anytime soon. So I think that there's a combination of recognizing that we're sort of in a new normal, of geopolitical tension, of resource constraints and bottlenecks and scarcity, and that we can do something about it, right? So it's not like, a natural disaster where you can sort of be like, well, what are you going to do? This is one where, like, aha, like we have a choice. We don't have to be dependent on these systems. And so um I I, I believe that that is different, and that we might actually move into a truly new mode. Um, at least that's what I'm paying attention to.
What a refreshing and empowering message. Thank you, Lena. I'm going to kick things over to Mike because I know he's got one or two questions from the audience. So, Mike,
Yep.
over to you.
Yep, Lena. So we had a question from the audience in regards to looking at things like natural gas plants, and this might be some sort of bridge, but there's still the unintended consequences from potential leaks or spills, some of the pollution that's created even in those plants. So the audience member is looking for what's something that we can do to help pressure governments in regards to using cleaner and more efficient energy.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I always, I worry a little bit about the messaging, right? That gas should be a bridge to something else, because these are resources that you build it, it's there for a long time, right? For 30, 40 years. And so, um, I, yeah, that's not messaging that I like really around a bridge. But the reality is that we have a lot of gas in our system. There is this kind of move to gas in terms of meeting demand from data centers and from AI. In terms of what people can do, I mean, I think there's probably a few things. We've been talking so far today about one, just about this sense of agency, right? I think that people and communities have the ability to act and to reduce their pull on the grid in ways that they just have not before. And especially at the community level, like, I know individuals, it makes a difference in aggregate, but at the community level, there is just a lot of opportunity to change the way community energy systems are supplied in ways that reduce demands on the grid and reduce demands on gas plants in particular, right? So a lot of gas plants are used to provide peak demand, and so especially if you can across a community install, enough combination batteries, energy efficiency, demand response, all the things, that has a disproportionate effect on reducing the peak, which reduces disproportionately the demand for gas and gas plants. But I guess the last thing I'll say, Mike, more generally, is that also a lot of this matters on who our leaders are. I think we can all we can vote, we can pay attention to not only who our Congress people and governors and elected officials are, but also who is on our public utility commissions, and how do we in some states we have the ability to elect those people, right? And a lot of people don't, because it's you don't pay a lot of attention to that level. But I think that paying attention to who's making decisions and influencing that where we can is one of the most powerful things.
And we have one more question, and then we'll have to wrap up. But it came in from Ralph. He says that, being paid to deliver cooling rather than kilowatts sounds like an opportunity to modify performance contracting. But how might that model be changed to reward delivering cooling?
It's a great question. And I think, I mean, this is the area where there's a lot of thinking to be done and a lot of opportunities. Is like, how do you, yes, when you look at performance contracting or other mechanisms like that, what would it actually look like to incentivize the delivery of the actual end use in ways that then the contractor or the company that is providing that have an incentive to maximize the efficiency with which they do that, because then they make more money, right? And so those are the things that I think we need to be experimenting with and looking for different models where they are working, and tying those into the structures that we have, so that you don't have to, it's unrealistic to think that we're going to completely change the way contractors work and the way companies work. But how do we look at these mechanisms that exist and tweak them, or test new things, or create new models that might actually reward that sort of value creation?
Well, thank you very much, Lena. We very much appreciate it. The insight is great, and RMI is doing wonderful work. So keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Mike, actually, if I may just chime in
Yeah.
really quickly. Lena, are there any resources or reports or anything in particular that you'd direct our audience to read, either on RMI's website or elsewhere, that would help continue to expand their thinking on this topic?
Yeah. Well, I have to direct you to RMI's website. I think that's
Yeah.
my that's my job.
And
And I will say, I'll use this opportunity to say that um, tomorrow, I think it's tomorrow, we're actually like launching a completely revamped RMI website, which I
so
think will
exciting.
be, yeah, it's really cool. It'll be much easier to navigate through and find the resources that people need. So check that out. But there are a lot of resources there that are about virtual power plants, that are about solutions for data centers, right? Where we're looking at what we call power couples, where you actually have the ability to proactively site a data center with an existing grid resource, and add solar and batteries and things that allow you to deploy that data center much quicker and much more cleanly. So we have a lot of reports and resources that we've been putting out on those types of grid resources and technologies, and increasingly some work. We are very committed in this year to re-elevating efficiency in the national narrative, and finding ways to support decision makers and key actors in the system to like crack these nuts, right? And so we're starting to put out more and more reports on efficiency and on distributed resources, even at a building level, and various things. So take a look there.
Thanks. All
Cool.
right, Mike, back
Thank
to
you
you.
so much.
Lena,
Awesome.
thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you. And thank you, Mary, for putting the link to the RMI website in the chat. Everybody can check that out. Our final session of this year's symposium will be presented by Tom Hoban and Neil Collins. Now, Tom is the president and chief investment officer of Kitson and Partners and has over 30 years of experience in the real estate industry. He helps set the strategic direction for K&P and has a primary focus on its investment strategy and financial performance. He's also, though, responsible for developing strategic budgetary plans, aligning financial goals, budgets, and forecasts, as well as identifying and mitigating financial risks. Now, prior to joining Kitson and Partners, Tom spent 8 years as an investment banker at Morgan Stanley, where he served as vice president of U.S. acquisitions for the Morgan Stanley Real Estate Fund. Neil Collins is the founder of Latitude Regenerative Real Estate, a brokerage and advisory platform focused on land, conservation, and place-based development. He's also a founding partner at Hamlet Capital, which invests selectively in agricultural and conservation-centered community projects. Neil is also the host of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast, where he explores the practical realities of regenerative development, land use, and long-term value creation. All right, Tom, we're going to start with you, sir.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the kind introduction. Let me try to see if I can share my screen.
Yep. And we can see it.
Can you see it?
Yep. We see it in the presenter view right now.
Okay, so let me then stop sharing that and share the right view. How do I do this? How's that? Is that better?
I will let you know as soon as it comes through, and it looks great.
All right, great. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate the introduction. It's great to be here today with everybody. Look forward to sharing some stories with you today about Kitson and Partners and Babcock Ranch. Let's see here. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Is it advancing here?
We're still on the title slide. It's a very scenic picture, though.
Let's see. And apologize, guys, for this little tech issue here. It's not cooperating on my side for a second. Give me a second here, Mike.
That's not a problem.
Let's try this again. We up and running?
Yes, we're back to the title slide again. And that
Okay,
great view.
Great. Okay. Thanks, guys. Thanks for your patience. Apologize for the glitch. So Kitson and Partners, we are a real estate development company, and we have been around since the early 90s. Our roots are up in the Northeast. I made our way to Florida in the mid-90s and got pretty darn busy down here pretty quick and decided to really exit the Northeast and focus 100% of our energies down here in the state of Florida, which we've been fully dedicated to since the early 2000s. Been around for a long time, have a great team here at Kitson and Partners that we work with every day. Got a great advisory board as well that's helped guide us and give us some great feedback along the way on this journey we've been on for several decades now. I think today we're really here to talk mostly about Babcock Ranch. And Babcock Ranch is a big project we've got in Southwest Florida. You know, it's 18,000 acres. Which is basically almost 25 square miles, larger than the size of Manhattan. And I think when most developers, look at a piece of land, they'll ask, how many rooftops can I fit on that land? I think for us, it was a much different exercise. We were out to see and prove that you could do an incredible, thoughtful development in conjunction with nature, hand in hand, and create the most sustainable, resilient, and innovative new town in the United States. And that a town and nature can live in harmony. And so that was really kind of part of our initiative out of the gate, was to be really sensitive to our land, our environment, surrounding environment, and develop in a way that was unique to our region. And we're really proud to share this story with you here today. So Babcock Ranch is in Southwest Florida. You can see it there on the map. It's It's about 15, 20 miles inland. We're about 30 feet above sea level, about 30-minute drive into downtown Fort Myers. Also about 35 minutes to two national airports in Punta Gorda and in Southwest Florida. Great location, lots of growth. And from a resilience perspective, being 20 plus miles inland and 30 feet above sea level give us a really great head start as it relates to storm surge and flood and other measures that we can get concerned about here in this region of the state. If we zoom in a little bit, you'll see here originally we bought 91,000 acres. That's what you're looking at here on the screen. That entire 91,000 acre footprint was bought in 2006. That's 143 square miles, which is 5 times the size of the island of Manhattan. And we turned around and sold 73,000 acres to the state of Florida and to Lee County for permanent preservation. So we sold 80% of the land into permanent preservation, and we kept 18,000 acres, which is now referred to as Babcock Ranch. Another vantage point here, how did this happen? If you look on this map on the right-hand side of the screen, it's just barely cut off, is Lake Okeechobee, which is a huge lake in the center of the state. And what you're looking at here is where Babcock sits, connecting basically Lake Okeechobee all the way to the Charlotte Harbor Basin, which is what you see there on the left side of your screen. The state was looking for a natural wildlife corridor to stretch between the lake and the Gulf, and Babcock was the missing piece. So we were able to step in and buy that entire 91,000 acre land position, knowing that the state was looking to connect this wildlife corridor, and Babcock was the missing piece, which led to the big sale of the state that I talked about there, 73,000 acres. If you look across the street from Babcock to the west, you'll see the Babcock Webb Wildlife Management Area, which is another 65,000 acres of land. And so we are truly embedded in nature. When you look at that 18,000 acre footprint, which is the town of Babcock Ranch, we're surrounded by nature on all sides. So having a keen eye on environmental sensitivity, ecology, habitat, species, et cetera, has been a big part of our mission and directive from the very beginning. And really what we've set out to do is redefine a bit, what quality of life means and how to bring a higher quality of life to the residents and the homeowners who choose to live and work at Babcock Ranch. And really, it's about delivering peace of mind, convenience in an innovative new town that has incredibly strong roots in resiliency and sustainability. This is a zoom in on the master plan itself. That's the 18,000 acre footprint you see on the right. You'll see it in kind of 3 different colors. You'll see the purple area on the left, the yellow area in the center, and the pink area to the right. Those are really kind of big picture. Those are 3 really large phases. Babcock will be home to 60,000 people when we're finished building. We've got about 17,000 people there today, and we'll have over 20,000 people there by the end of the year. It sits, as I said, on 18,000 acres. We've got entitlements for up to 22,000 homes and 6 million square feet of commercial. And what you see up there on the north side of this map in yellow, that is our solar farm, which I will talk about in a few minutes here into the presentation. This slide here, this has been our compass for the last 20 years. We put this together in 2005 when we contracted to buy the land. We went out and we did extensive tours across the country of what we deemed to be some of the greater places out there to live, and took a lot of notes, did a lot of learning, a lot of lessons learned with the folks who developed those communities and those towns to really figure out what made them special, and how could we take some of those learnings, put them into our strategy, and execute under a new mindset for Babcock Ranch. So getting these right, if we could get these 8 things right: environment, health and wellness, education, energy, technology, transportation, storm safety, and of course, recreation and fun. If we could figure out a way to incorporate all these into our daily lives at Babcock Ranch through really thoughtful design, planning, amenities, et cetera, we felt we had a great shot to be successful at Babcock Ranch. And this has really helped guide us over the last 20 years at Babcock Ranch. Initially, we went back and looked at the maps from the early 1900s of the Babcock property, really to study the natural flowways in the property. How did water make its way onto the property and off the property? And where did that water flow? And when thinking about development, a lot of developers will come in and really clear cut the land, mitigate, and create as much upland as possible, given the region that we're living in Southwest Florida, we recognize the importance of thinking long-term and thinking about storm safety and resiliency, and wanted to see what Mother Nature was naturally going to do in this region. And it really helped guide us in terms of thinking through a master plan and a design for this community. We consciously stayed out of those natural flowways where the water wanted to be. We've tracked Mother Nature, as I'm sure many folks in this call have. She's got a pretty good track record, and we figured rather than fight it, we would embrace it. And rather than come in and clear cut this land and develop where we wanted to, we let the land speak to us a bit and guide us as to where we would actually impact the land. And most of the land that we're building on has already been impacted by the Babcock family over their 100 years of stewardship of this land. This is a good visual of those natural flowways today and what they look like. Series of trails, parks, canals, recreation, and just general beauty and great view corridors throughout Babcock Ranch as you come through. Another nice picture here of the wetlands that I talked about. Not only staying out of the flowways, but looking where the natural wetlands are. And once again, rather than mitigate those wetlands to create uplands to sell more land, embrace those wetlands. They're beautiful. They create an incredibly, timeless, majestic kind of feeling within Babcock Ranch. These have looked the same for hundreds of years. So not only are they actually become an amenity from a view perspective, but they also are incredible reservoirs of storage of water, as you can see here in this photo. And so when we do have our high storm activity, which we're coming into now in the summer months through the end of the year, we've got natural reservoirs to really help mitigate risks of flooding and the like. It also acts as very natural filter marshes to clean the water that comes onto the property before it flows off and perks into the aquifer system. So really multi-purpose use for these wetlands. This is a shot of a before and after of some of our wetlands based upon not just preserving them and investing in them and a restorative process. And we've gone through a series of investing in weir systems throughout Babcock Ranch to try and restore the property to its original intent before the Babcock family impacted with farming and cattle and ag. And here's a great illustration of us doing that by investing in these weirs to recreate and rehydrate these natural habitats to create that ecosystem of species, flora, fauna to come back to Babcock Ranch, which has been hugely successful. Another shot of this is our rain gardens and native plant materials. We built these throughout the community, and they hold as water runoff and bioswales with all these native plant materials, which are much more resilient to this climate and also much less reliant upon irrigation. They are naturally irrigated in this tropical climate without the expense of having to put an irrigation system in throughout. So multiple reasons for this as well. Best practices, not only is it best practices, but it creates value for the community as well, having this natural amenity permeate throughout. And finally, on the water side, we've got a smart water management system where all of the lakes at Babcock Ranch interconnect. And there's piezometers in these lakes that can beam up to the NOAA and do predictive analytics on rainfall. And we can lower these lake levels when we're anticipating heavy rainfall to, again, help mitigate the risk of flood. So this is not by accident, right? There's lots of time and effort that was put into the design and engineering of Babcock Ranch to create this resilient hometown where people can feel safe, sheltering in place, and living at Babcock Ranch due to a lot of the thoughtful design and engineering behind the water management plan at Babcock. A picture of our school system. This is our school campus. This is a K-12 public charter school. What you're looking at here in the near part of the picture is the K-8. What you see there on the upper left is our 40,000 square foot field house, which doubles as a storm shelter for the region in times of storm. Babcock Ranch residents can shelter in place in their homes, but the folks that live in Southwest Florida that live near the coast that are forced to evacuate during storms can come to Babcock Ranch, and that facility turns into a hurricane evacuation facility for Southwest Florida. We had over 2,000 people in that shelter during Hurricane Milton and Helene, rather. And the building you see on the right there is the high school. We've got over 1,200 students in the K-12. We've also got an autism school coming. We've got a primary school coming. We've got pre-K, daycare throughout Babcock Ranch. And this school is a really interesting opportunity for the children to go to the school as it studies the town's data. They track solar output. They study the migration of the Florida panther throughout our wildlife corridors. We're not just building a town; it's really building a mindset, for the town and for the families in the town. students grow up understanding this intersection of technology, energy, and environmental stewardship, and the importance of sustainability, resilience, and innovation, and how it's helped. That's what's helped create this incredible, unique town that they live in. And it also serves as continuing education, lifelong learning, not just for the students, but for the residents and the homeowners and the companies that also reside at Babcock Ranch. This might not be the prettiest picture, but it's an important one. What you're looking at here towards the bottom on the right is our substation. That's where our solar feeds into from the Florida Power and Light Solar Farm, which I'll talk about in the next slide. That is an elevated substation. So from a flooding perspective, it's elevated for risk mitigation. It's also got multiple feeders subsurface coming in from all over the state. We can pull power from Miami on the east side of the state when we're having issues on the West Coast. So it's got incredible redundancy built into it, and everything that comes in on the transmission lines to Babcock Ranch hits this substation and is buried thereafter and flows underground. So everything's buried here. The power, the Wi-Fi, the fiber, and obviously on the north side of the slide, what you see is our water and wastewater utility called Town and Country. And all that clearly is underground as well. So from a risk perspective, all of our utilities are buried. There's incredible resilience story to that as well. And I'll talk about the impacts that that's had here in a few slides. A quick peek at our solar. This is a solar farm that was done with Florida Power and Light. We were the first solar powered town in the United States. 150 megawatts of solar photovoltaics generated on this site on just about 900 acres of land. We also had the first solar to battery storage facility, which holds 10 megawatts, which is what you see there on the right. So we have the ability to store and redistribute power for up to about 4 hours. In times of when it gets dark or when the sun goes down, we have 4 hours or so of redistribution through that battery system, which has been a huge asset to us as well on the resilience front. So a pretty unique story for us at Babcock. And what does it all mean? We did all this planning and design and strategy knowing that we'd be tested. And Babcock Ranch, the size that it is, 20,000 plus homes, 6 million square feet, 18,000 acres, we knew we'd be tested multiple times over the life cycle of Babcock. And boy, did we get tested in 2022 with Hurricane Ian, and really put all of these systems I just talked about, our water management system, our power, our water utility, our fiber, all of it got tested in Hurricane Ian. Hurricane Ian, as you will recall, that hit land on Captiva Island, on Sanibel Island, and Fort Myers Beach. It hit land as a Category 4. It made its way directly to Babcock Ranch. You can see the path of the hurricane on the map. You can see the yellow star here where Babcock is. It sat on top of us for about 8 hours with 100-mile-an-hour winds, sustained, and up to 150 gusts. And really, really challenged us and put us to the test. It was really our ultimate test to see how it would perform. And I think this next slide will help illustrate how we did during Hurricane Ian.
Babcock Ranch is the brainchild of eco-conscious developer and former professional football player Sid Kitson, with a dream to build America's first environmentally friendly, hurricane-proof, fully sustainable small town.
While neighboring towns were devastated, Babcock Ranch never flooded, never lost power, and has since survived Hurricane Milton in similar fashion.
These photos show part of the ranch before and after it was developed. All the dark patches are wetlands, and you can see how the ranch was built around them, leaving some areas where they'll flood and connect untouched.
Building the homes the right way, building a community the right way, because it's just not the home construction, but the community itself also needs to be storm resistant.
Babcock Ranch is about half an hour northeast of Fort Myers, Florida. Developers are building nearly 20,000 homes for a projected 50,000 people.
A dream begins with a reimagine, a bold move. If we work together, we can preserve all this land, and at the same time, we'll build this new sustainable town. Babcock is proof that a new city can work hand in hand with the environment.
So hopefully that gives you a sense. Obviously, all the years of planning, design, engineering, when put to the test, thankfully worked. We had a great relative outcome in our region. It was a very difficult time for Southwest Florida, a tragic time for our area. And amidst all that chaos, Babcock Ranch stood tall. We had very little damage, never lost power, never lost our Wi-Fi, never went on a boil water notice with our utility. all of our shops and retail were able to remain open. And like I said, we housed several thousand residents from the region of Southwest Florida who needed shelter during the storm. So a very proud moment for us, and one that's really had a big impact on not just our homeowners, but on Babcock's recognition in the marketplace. Most of the comments to date here in the presentation have been about resilience. We also have a lot of fun at Babcock. Health and wellness is a big theme for us. This is just some illustrations of kind of activities and events that we have programmed. There are over 700 events programmed throughout the year at Babcock Ranch. It's multi-generational, lots of families, lots of young children, also folks on the other side of that barbell that are kind of towards that later stage of life of retirement and post-retirement and everything in between. We have 100+ miles of hiking trails and biking trails throughout Babcock Ranch. Design matters. You can really influence behavior with good design. We've got extra wide sidewalks. We've got extra safe bike lanes. It really helps make it more comfortable and convenient for people to get out of their homes, hike, bike, walk throughout the community. All homes are located within a short walking distance to parks and trails and trailheads. So really kind of, really trying to influence behaviors to get people out and be mobile and have movement by design, which is what you see in some of these illustrations here. In addition to the health and wellness, from that wellness side, there's also the clinical side. We do have urgent care here with TGH, Tampa General Hospital, in our shops at Yellow Pine. We've also got more primary care and lab space here. And finally, with Lee Health, we have the almost 30,000 square foot Lee Health facility, which has more primary care and a 27,000 square foot wellness facility as well. And so that's Babcock Ranch in a nutshell. I could talk for a lot longer. I know I'm trying to be sensitive to time here. I think I'm over by 1 minute. So I'll stop here. I know, pause and hand it over back to Sarah and Mike, and look forward to some questions afterwards.
Tom, thanks so much. I've heard your story several times before, and every time I learn something new, and it's so inspirational. So thanks for sharing, and I do look forward to asking you a slew of questions once we get to Q&A. But before we do that, Neil, I think you're up, and we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Sarah. Wow, what an impressive presentation, and a lineup today to play cleanup here is a little bit intimidating after creating a really sustainable town that Tom shared about. I'm going to present on my screen as well. Let's see. Can everybody see this okay?
That's great. Okay. Yep, it looks wonderful.
Yeah, so, I want to talk about really the work that we're doing, which is informed by a lot of my lived experience. What we are focusing on is creating healthy communities and preserving farmland as kind of our entry point into the real estate industry. And I'm calling in today from Whidbey Island on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish on a beautiful biodynamic farm. And I'm representing two different companies that allows me to have access into two very different areas of the real estate industry. The first is whenever I put on an investor hat through Hamlet Capital, we're really looking to bring in catalytic capital into early stage master planned communities to really meet a gap in the financial landscape to enable sponsors and developers to go through the planning required to build in resilience and do the planning as Tom was just mentioning. The second is I wear a cap as a co-founder of a real estate brokerage called Latitude, where we are kind of dubbing ourselves the first regenerative brokerage in the country. We work with a lot of ecologically resilient and life-giving properties on the sales side, and we work with buyers to actually take more kind of conventional properties and create pathways for resilience and health and well-being, and really what we call a spirited place. And that enables us to see interesting trends taking place across the industry. I never really thought that I was going to end up in the real estate industry. I got a master's degree in sustainable development, and real estate was never part of that curriculum. A lot of it was around poverty alleviation, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But I grew up in South Louisiana and experienced so many of these 10,000-year events, like Hurricane Katrina, followed by another hurricane a couple of years later, to realize that climate change is no longer a future risk. I think for my generation as a millennial, it was always something that we had to think about in the future and framed as, by 2050, things could be really bad. But now we're living through an experience where I think almost everybody on this call and in general culture has been touched by hurricanes, by forest fires, floods, and droughts. And so that was the backdrop of me saying, look, whatever I want to do professionally, I want it to make an impact. And I found the arena to be really working at the community level. I spent a lot of my early career working with farmers and fishermen in Eastern Europe and in South Asia, and really started to pioneer approach. Instead of asking, what do you need? How can we help? I really found that there was a great path to say, what would you like to create? And that was the backdrop into utilizing the voices of the community to empower them to say, okay, this is a planning approach and an empowerment approach to create the kind of results that the local voices are sharing. And it brought me into the real estate industry whenever I started to work with five-star resorts out of the country of the Maldives, and realizing that real estate development was either a catalyzing force for destruction or for ecological resilience and revitalization. And that brought me back into the United States, where I subsequently spent time doing $3 billion worth of mixed-use commercial real estate, and realizing that these large-scale projects are very different than the ones that Tom is talking about, where there might be a little bit of credence these days to talk about energy efficiency, but there's still a huge structural barrier and cultural barriers to embracing resilient design and development. When creating these new districts, oftentimes the development teams are forced to really only look at it from the financial perspective, trying to align the architecture with the pro forma and the capital stack to overcome what is largely, as we all know, a very short-term horizon. And I think from the perspective of really trying to understand what the market is, if you look at it just from either the price per square foot or even what is the energy profile of this building, we're really not looking at the holistic context of where the market is at these days. So often we're finding home buyers and residents that are coming to us with sentiments around health and well-being. They're coming to us talking about wanting to be closer to nature, closer to food, closer to community. And I realized that whenever we started to see more and more people that were having cancer, autoimmune diseases, and serious chronic illnesses show up in their families, and you start to chart the polycrisis and realize why is this happening? What does the built environment have to do with it? And it's not just about the materials that we're using or the energy profile, but it is really about how do we design for community agency and belonging. And that really ported over well into a community-based approach, asking what do we want to create here, and how do we create and design places for community and togetherness. At the same time, I love the question of how do you design for health and wellness, because it really starts to illuminate what does health and well-being actually look like, and how does that interface with the real estate industry. And it doesn't take very long to go down a rabbit hole to realize that food is such a central component. And I love creating a really good metaphor with the places that we're involved in. And I think food and bringing people together at a communal table is just such a rich way to build community. But the impacts on those food systems to enable healthy, quality food systems is getting eroded right now. So we really started to focus on this sliver of the real estate industry, really at the peri-urban edge, where we're seeing a lot of farms get converted over to urban sprawl and to other commercial land uses that are not synonymous with either conservation or agriculture, and creating more of an isolationist type of community format through, I think, this long-held approach of the white picket fence and the single family. Meanwhile, we're pushing farmers further away from the people and the people further away from their food. And fundamentally, it's missing the mark of where all these other people are saying, look, this is the type of community that I want to live in. And the market is just not providing that to any stretch of the imagination right now. And so our work over the past really 6 or 7 years has been to rethink growth beyond this duality between we can either live in cities, and whenever I was coming up in my early career, it was the sustainable future is a very urban future. We have to have density. Let's go up, let's go out, versus this old pattern of we're just going to sprawl out. And so the opportunity right now, that as I see it, that I'm so compelled to, is how do we actually conserve this land for farms, conservation, and habitat? How do we start to embrace what a community really looks like instead of just the age old, we're going to try to target large square foot homes for a certain price point, but how do we create more homes for people of all ages and incomes? How do we expand access to healthy and local food? And then how do we be a positive and catalytic force in local communities? And so we're doing that by actually taking a planning framework and looking at that through the regenerative lens that really comes down to 3 main areas. We're really looking at what is the character of a place that can inform the density. More and more communities are putting together climate resilient plans that wants to inform more walkability and alternative modes of transportation. How do we start to use natural systems that guide infrastructure? You realize that so much of our world really externalizes and covers up these very linear systems that even if we have lots of solar panels or ground source heat pump, geothermal, we're still working on a linear infrastructure from wastewater and stormwater that is pretty ecologically disastrous. And the last thing that I'll say on the planning lens, and we could spend a long time on this, which is we actually like to take the time to engage community stakeholders to inform the development plan. It's one of those areas that if you're going to be doing real estate, you're working within 50 shades of gray. And there's a lot of political risk that comes with these projects. And I like to tell the sponsors and developers that we work with that sometimes we do have to go slow to go fast, and we do have to find the different voices within a community to come together to shape a plan and have those voices heard so that we're not running the risk of having the project blow up or stall out indefinitely. And for us, we're really excited about actually embedding plans within conservation communities where we're preserving at least 70% of the developable site to keep as agriculture and open space, and then converting farms into civic hearts of the community and embracing a regenerative agriculture approach to the actual farming activities. And there's starting to be more and more precedent for this, of people saying, look, we can either develop these or we want to live in these kinds of communities. And there's taking a lot of different they're taking a lot of inspiration from the regenerative agriculture movement, which is saying, how do we create flourishing environments, and how do we start to move from monoculture towards diverse, resilient ecosystems? And if we take that approach towards human habitat and our own housing, we really start to infuse that into creating for multi-generations, diverse home types. So you have accessibility, you have affordability through design. We have approaches to create more mixed income communities so that it's not just for a sliver of the population, and really trying to work towards this concept of a whole community. And what we're finding is that there's a lot of developer and municipal benefit to this, where we just think that it makes really good sense to engage in these types of projects. We're finding that there is a growing sentiment of buyers. 73% of buyers prioritize access to food. There's premiums on those home units that are in these types of developments. There can certainly be higher absorption rates, which is really a leading factor for the success of a project whenever you're doing kind of large-scale master plan communities. And there's a lot of different ways in which a developer can set up these projects where you have multiple exit scenarios. And I really like to break this down because I think that there's a lot of people that are saying, wouldn't it be amazing if we could go out and we could get our friends together and create a community? And even the ones that are very serious about this and they're looking at it from how do we go create a community? Maybe it's not 22,000 homes, but what would that look like for several dozen homes or several hundred homes? There's a lot of risk to go from land acquisition, entitlement, putting in the infrastructure, and then building vertical construction. And we really like to break that up and say, what part of this process does it make sense to really fill? And how do we bring capital and enliven each one of those sectors while mitigating the risk of it? And on the same side, we're getting called in by more municipalities that are really looking at this strategy to say we want to actually create more conservation style districts where we want to preserve the rural character of our farm or of our communities, but we're desperately needing housing. And we see this as a way in which we can increase our tax base. Instead of sprawling out and creating all these roads and infrastructure, can we actually create more of a financially viable path by clustering and creating more walkable villages? You bring a lot of business into these areas if through mixed use opportunities. You're bringing opportunities by enabling aspiring young farmers to have land access. You're bringing kind of upfront capital so that you reduce the barriers of entry for them. And then you really get into the conservation side of things. Tons of public health benefits that come from that, just looking at it through the human lens, through the biophilic nature of these properties, and being closer to nature, being closer to food, and living in much more of a non-toxic environment. And the way that we're doing this is really trying to understand, where does capital want to play in these projects? For us, what that means is we'll often try to break the project apart into different sectors and say, where is value generated that makes sense for market rate capital to get involved? We see that through entitlement of land, and there's an uplift of there. There is financial increase whenever it comes to putting in the infrastructure into the ground and into the roads and into home site creation. There is a lot of value that is generated from vertical construction. And each one of those, that is really the right capital source for that type of activity. But increasingly, we're working with families and organizations that are interested in actually putting impact dollars and concessionary capital into places that have different outcomes around affordability, conservation, agriculture, education, arts, and things like that. And really trying to mix and match the right funding for the right outcomes and coming at it from a much more holistic perspective. And we're starting to see this with more precedent from even kind of conventional developers that are coming into the space, and they're developing these types of communities that agriculture is very central to the plan. Like in Iowa, there's Middlebrook Farm. Serenbe is a really great example of actually doing hamlet style development and creating a 60,000 acre conservation zoning in which enables clustered housing to preserve open space. And then you can even do these in much more urban formats with Fox Point Farm, where this is kind of 3- and 4-story walk-ups, condominium style on a 22-acre parcel in Encinitas. The farm is definitely the civic heartbeat of this property, and it really exposes that the agriculture can feed into a brewery, a coffee roaster, a market, and it really is the anchor to create a very lively atmosphere for the residential side of these projects. And so I'm going to pause it there because I know that we've got a lot of questions, but I appreciate the opportunity to share just a very high level of our work at Hamlet Capital and Latitude.
Fantastic. Neil, thank you so much. What an interesting journey that you've had, and a really fascinating story, one that certainly complements the story about Babcock Ranch that Tom shared. And Tom, oh, wonderful. I was going to ask you to pop on your camera. So there you are. I think that this session is so interesting because you both have challenged some of the deepest assumptions embedded in modern development, asking questions about whether land is a commodity or a living system. Is development extractive or additive or regenerative? Is housing an investment vehicle or is it a place to build a life, a community? And are we optimizing for quarterly returns or multi-general prosperity? So thank you for asking those questions in your stories. Tom, I want to start with a question for you. Babcock Ranch is arguably one of the most ambitious real-world experiments in sustainable, future-focused, resilient development in the country. And as you shared, after Hurricane Ian and other hurricanes, Babcock Ranch really became a national and international symbol of resilient development. What lesson did that experience, particularly, let's just say the repeated hurricanes, teach you that no planning model ever could? Oh, Tom, I think you're on mute.
I'm mute. Sorry, guys.
There you go.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the questions and the kind words. There's a lot there. I mean, my gosh, it was I think one of the in your introductory comments, I think thinking differently and maybe trying to do things that are outside the norm, that are in that, call it, innovative realm, is difficult. It's challenging. It's hard to get buy-in and to get that alignment of interest when you try to do something differently. And that's whether that's your capital, whether that's your own team, whether that's the local municipality, the environment, like whatever it might be. Doing something new and different is more challenging. And I think a lot of that challenge comes through just the unknown. And a lot of it comes through the cost. What's it going to cost, right? You hear that question. I'm sure, Neil, you heard that question a couple hundred times over the last, 5 to 10 years as well. It just, when you try to do something different, it isn't always the cheapest option. And I think some of the things we're looking to do that were unconventional on the water management side, for example, there's not a lot of comparables out there to point to. And here's what someone else did. We prefer to lead and not follow. And when you lead, you don't always have a great data set to compare to. And, I think for us, there were some educated bets we were making based upon, our intuition and the homework we had done, but we didn't have valid proof of a lot of it. And it's hard to sit there in a room and say, what's my ROI going to be on that extra dollar or that extra $5 or $10, whatever it's going to be. And I think macro, Sarah, that there's lesson learned on the backside of Ian, and looking at the devastation that took place in our region and the literally billions of dollars of damage to the region. And Babcock came out with virtually zero damage at all. Whatever incremental investment we made 10 years prior on engineering work or horizontal infrastructure or energy, it paid for itself 10 times over with the fact that we had a town that was up and operating and running, that our Publix was the only, grocery store in the region that was open and operating. We got all this incredibly positive news press that resulted in a huge influx of demand to come look at Babcock Ranch and what's going on here. How'd you guys do this? What's the magic, recipe behind this outcome? So it really kind of helped put us on the map, so to speak. And so I think, depending upon your organizational structure, your capital structure, your governance structure, I think you can get caught up on a little bit of analysis paralysis on the early stage of some of these projects to try to justify. I'm not suggesting to be reckless, but I think there's some things you really can't quantify. We couldn't quantify the impact of what Hurricane Ian would be on the positive side of a good outcome. And it's been a tremendous lift for us. Ironically, it was difficult for the region, but for us specifically, it was a tremendous lift for Babcock Ranch's recognition in the marketplace and demand from homeowners who said, it's just safer to live there. And if I'm going to live in Southwest Florida, why wouldn't I want to live in the safest place in that region of the state? And so, again, that might not be exactly what you're asking about. My first thought was, that was one of those moments where afterwards we just kind of step back and say, gosh, all the time we spent, hand wringing and hair pulling in the conference room 10 years ago about this dollar and that dollar, it was multiples paid for and then some on the other side of that storm.
Well, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, never waste the opportunity that comes from a good catastrophe.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Uh, so, Neil, a question for you. You talk about regenerative development instead of sustainable development. What's the difference and why does that distinction matter? That's kind of layer one of the question. And then what is a truly regenerative neighborhood or community look and feel like, and what has to change in order to make those mainstream?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I don't think that we have the luxury anymore to sustain the systems uh, and take a neutral stance going forward. That's what really attracted me towards the regenerative movement is like this is really hitting me on a deep philosophical level. If it's our time to really re-remember and rediscover our role as a keystone species, that we create the conditions for all life to flourish. And that I think is really what attracted me first into the real estate space as a developer, and then as someone that wants to bring capital in to help inform those folks that share a similar philosophy on regeneration over sustainability, where I think it's too easy just to say, look, because we have recycling or whatever it is, kind of an external amenity, that we get to pat ourselves on the back, and it's really trying to hold much more of a holistic approach with different outcomes that we're oriented towards as we go into developed land.
Thanks, Neil. Tom, so for decades, we've treated land as something to be bought and sold and subdivided and monetized as opposed to something that I think you've done very well at Babcock Ranch, which is something to be nurtured and utilized to actually benefit the community. So what's the biggest consequent of that legacy mindset that most people still don't see or understand?
Yeah, look, that's another great question, Sarah. It is a mindset, and so I think given the size and scale of Babcock Ranch, when you take on a project of that size and scale, it forces you to step back and really kind of think long term. You alluded to this earlier, and I think you can make the analogy with like the public companies who chase the quarterly earnings and chase the Wall Street analyst report versus private companies that maybe can think a little longer term and not be such a short-minded approach to things. I think the larger scale the project, the longer term you need to think. And, what you do in the first phase, has a material impact on what happens in the fifth phase, right? So I think when you have a footprint that's 18,000 acres, and if you saw that land, you saw some of it in the video, some of it in the pictures, there's some spectacular land there. And I think if you stop and listen to the land a little bit, it sounds corny, but you get out, you walk the land. You got in our business, right? I'm sure, Neil, you got to get out and walk these sites, right? You got to walk these projects, and you kind of start feeling a certain way as you walk through these, and you can kind of have some vision around what could become of this place. And I think it's addition by subtraction, right? Where you or vice versa, right? Where I think a lot of natural instincts are to say, I need to find as much upland as possible to create as much income producing assets and or sellable real estate as possible, which you can do, and a lot of people do that, and that's up to others. But I think for us, it was more, how do we do the merge? How do we combine the two? And how does the 1 + 1 = 3? If we can find the right balance of preserving the land, and I didn't mention this yet, but we sold 80% of our land in the 91,000 acres we sold to the state. We kept 18,000 acres. Of the 18,000 acres we kept, we preserved 9,000 of that, right? So half of the land that we kept, we put into preservation as well. So 90%, over 90% of the original, property we bought is in permanent preservation. We're very proud of that. And on the other 9,000 acres is where all our development takes place. And so you really have this kind of really interesting mix of development around nature, around wetlands, around habitat species, et cetera. And I think if you've been there, Sarah, I think, and we hear this a lot, it feels different when you drive through the not that there's an entry, it's a town, but when you drive into Babcock Ranch and you just drive around the network of roads there for the first few minutes, it feels different. It feels like it's been there forever, right? It doesn't feel contrived. There's a genuineness to it. And to the extent I think you can afford to think long term and look at preservation as a way to create a really genuine experience, I think that's what a lot of buyers are looking for. I think not every buyer wants to live in Disney World. They want to visit Disney World, but they want to live in a place that's more genuine and more authentic. And I think if you can embrace the land around you, there's an authenticity to it. In our region, there's an environmental stewardship aspect of it. There's a resilience component to it. There's a view premium and a view corridor to it. And there's an embedded in nature aspect to it. So that it's really multiple. There's multiple reasons for it. And I think, every piece of land is different. Every region's different. So for us, it was really kind of finding that meld and that merge of the built environment and the natural environment coexisting together to create a really unique living experience. And that's what Babcock Ranch has become.
Yeah. You talk about listening to the land, and I would say that, at this point, it's not corny. It's actually necessary. It reduces risk. It builds in resiliency, as you've shown, as you've managed stormwater through, keeping the natural swales and mangroves and things like that. My husband and I live at 9,000 feet in the most remote county in the lower 48 in Colorado. And he's a builder, so he builds. And our lesson is let the mountain win, right? You're not going to win against the mountain, whatever it wants to do. If it wants to have an avalanche chute or a seasonal stream or whatever it is, let the mountain win. So, Neil, along those same lines, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a philosophical question because you've mentioned philosophy a few times. What does nature understand about long-term value that Wall Street still doesn't? And what's the most valuable asset in a community that never appears on a balance sheet?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually would like to be a little bit contrarian that like we've built this Wall Street system on kind of exponential growth, and that in essence is what nature can do. If you look at the exponentiality that exists within one apple seed, how many different apples come from that. And essentially we're living upon the result of exponentially growing natural living ecosystems. But because we've really taken this kind of short-term view of how do we maximize yield right now in very short-term time horizons, we're starting to undermine that ability for future growth and for that resilience of these living systems. And so that's really where I think there is areas to harmonize an approach to bring capital into these projects. And it's just really figuring out how they can start to talk in the same language to each other.
Interesting. Tom, you've been at Babcock Ranch now for many years. If you had to develop it today, what would you do differently? And what do you think is the next Babcock Ranch, in quotes, idea that sounds crazy today, but will seem obvious 10 years from now?
Wow. Okay. Great question. Great question, Sarah. So we kind of joke Babcock as our 20-year overnight success story because we've been at this for a long time. It takes a long time. So you can't control timing, but we bought Babcock in 06. And if anyone on this phone recalls, 08 happened 2 years later, which was a pretty difficult stretch for most everybody in the economy and in the world. And I think, that kind of set us back a little bit in terms of, our momentum to keep going at Babcock back when we were kind of getting full steam. And it resulted in a recalibration of timing. Not really vision. The vision has really been consistent. I put up that one slide with our core initiatives. I think those have been copied and pasted for the last 20 years. We haven't changed or deviated from those. But how to get there from A to B has changed. And I think there's a real good lesson. And I think I used this expression in the discussion earlier, but alignment of interest is really so important. And I think, getting out in front of these kind of projects in the community, talking to the residents, the homeowners, the county officials, the environmental community, the capital, your team, I think creating that alignment of interest early is really, really important. I also feel like the idea of something as big as Babcock and the vision that it is, recognition and awareness of what you're good at and what you're not good at. And you can be a great visionary and have a great, vision for the future, but you really need to find the right partner and series of partners who can help you bring that vision to life and translate that vision into reality. So whether that's Florida Power and Light and the Energy, Lee Health Memorial and the Health and Wellness, Tampa General, the list goes on. Lumen, on the fiber. It requires a really broad approach to execution when you have a big vision like that. And so I think we figured that out, and I think we recognized the importance of it. But I think earlier on, it could have allowed us to maybe get started a little bit earlier, post-great financial crisis. So I would, encourage that kind of thinking big, but thinking about who are the common stakeholders out there that could help us convert vision to reality, and having that alignment of interest really tight across the broad spectrum of constituents.
Wonderful. Neil, I have one more question for you, and then I'm going to kick it over to Mike because I know he's got one or two from the audience before we wrap up. All right, another kind of philosophical one, hopefully with a little bit of a bang. What's something that we've normalized in modern development that future generations will find absurd or even morally questionable? And if land is a living system instead of a commodity, should we even be allowed to own it?
Oh gosh, yeah. That last one really opens up a can of worms here. It makes me think of a framework called the three horizons, where Horizon 1 is business as usual. Horizon 2 is like we're trying to do better, or we're trying to do less bad, and Horizon 3 is that regenerative future that we're all striving for. But sometimes it's really difficult to go from Horizon 1 to Horizon 3, despite people saying it would be amazing if we decommodified land and it was all commons. You're not going to get there overnight, and you have tens, hundreds of trillions of dollars kind of working against you to go into that right away. So I think that's the long arc for sure. But I think what we really need to remember is that the world that we're living in is the world that we've invested in. And as long as we understand where capital flows, those are the outcomes that we're going to get. Then I think it really opens up what do we value, and where does capital need to enliven the approach that we take to land and habitat and home and community. So I think that's something that I just want to always keep front and center, and try to take something that can feel very complex into the simple and keep it in front of us. What do we want to invest in?
I love that. Thank you. So Neil and Time, I'm going to kick it over to Mike to ask you just one or two last questions and then wrap it up. So I'm out for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right. I've got one question for each of you. And for those of you who are sending in questions, Neil earlier put his email address up on his slide. Tom, I'm not sure if you did or either, but we're going to try and get to one question for each of you to wrap up today. Question to Tom. This came in from Bob Krieger. He understood, or he seemed to recall that part of your electrical resilience was a microgrid solution called block energy. Is he remembering that correctly?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So we don't have a microgrid there. We've got, almost 900 acres of solar photovoltaic. And I say Florida Power and Light is the energy provider. We had the land, they do the power. We're not a utility provider on power. So our solar gets generated on our land. Our solar gets consumed by our needs on the town level, and whatever isn't used by the town makes its way to the grid.
Okay.
And so we are a net producer of energy at Babcock, and we will be even at build out with 60,000 people there. But it's not on a microgrid. It's not off the grid. It's really connected to the grid. So there might have just been a little bit of misinformation there.
Yeah. No, that's okay. I appreciate you clearing that up.
Yep.
The question to Neil. Let's say that you've got someone who is interested in starting an agri-hood, and they had access to capital, whether it be, with a group or by themselves individually. What is the best first step to take on something like that?
I think it's really making sure that you're working in an area that is going to be favorable to that type of development. It's unfortunate, but people do get into these situations where they're buying land, they have these great visions, and then they're just going nowhere in terms of the zoning and the municipality. And so it doesn't involve a lot of stakeholder buy-in, working, if you're doing a plan large enough where you've really got to get political buy-in. I think that's something first and foremost to do your diligence and do pre-application meetings, work with people that have done this before, and realize that this is a team sport. And and it's best done through a consortium of partners rather than going at it alone.
All right. Thank you, sir. All right. I would love to ask you many more questions as well, just like Sarah, but I do need to wrap up. So do want to thank Tom and Neil for coming on and kind of talking about their respective projects and giving people really that example of what is possible. And hopefully that is able to inspire other developers, other investors, other builders to kind of rethink how to do development. So appreciate you both for giving us those kind of inspirational moments.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Mike.
All right, that is a wrap on the Green Builder Media 2026 Sustainability Symposium Systems Reckoning. Thank you to all of our attendees, our entire lineup of speakers over the past 2 days. A big thank you to our wonderful sponsors, Train Technologies, James Hardy, TimberTech, Provia, and iAtmo. For Mary Kestner, Sarah Gutterman, and the entire Green Builder Media crew, some of which you saw today, some of which you didn't, but they're all a great, wonderful team. Love working with them. Thank you for attending the 2026 Sustainability Symposium. I'm Mike Calignan, and I hope to see you at one of our upcoming webinars. Until next time, have a great summer and stay safe, stay healthy, and take care, everyone. So long.